Hey everyone, this is the ultimate serial killer's iceberg. And I was thinking of an intro, but now I don't think there's anything to say except that please enjoy the video and thank you very much for watching. Now let's start the video with the first entry of the very first tier with none other than the infamous Jeffrey Dahmer. Jeffrey Dahmer, born in 1960 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, had a troubled upbringing. His parents' marriage was unstable, with his mother suffering from depression and his father often absent. Dahmer's early life was marked by isolation and strange fascinations, particularly with dead animals, which began after watching his father remove animal bones from under their house. He started collecting roadkill and preserving animal bones, a hobby his father unknowingly encouraged by teaching him how to clean and preserve them. In high school, Dahmer became a loner, turning to alcohol to cope. Despite showing some academic potential, he struggled socially and began to exhibit increasingly bizarre behavior, such as faking seizures and mocking people with disabilities. During this time, he also started to grapple with his homosexuality and began having dark fantasies involving control and submission, which eventually merged with his interest in dissection. In 1978, just after graduating, Dahmer committed his first murder, killing 18-year-old Stephen Hicks. He bludgeoned and strangled Hicks, dismembering the body and later dissolving the remains. After this crime, Dahmer briefly served in the U.S. Army, but his alcoholism led to his discharge. In the mid-1980s, Dahmer killings escalated as he began luring men to his grandmother's home, where he would drug, assault, and murder them. His grandmother, disturbed by his behavior and the foul odors from her home, eventually forced him to move out. Dahmer's killing spree intensified in his Milwaukee apartment in the late 1980s and early 1990s. His methods became more gruesome, involving necrophilia, cannibalism, and attempts to preserve body parts. Despite prior arrests for molesting a boy, Dahmer's crimes went unnoticed until 1991, when one of his intended victims, Tracy Edwards, managed to escape and lead police to his apartment. Inside, they found a nightmarish scene, including human remains stored in the refrigerator and freezer. In 1992, Dahmer was sentenced to life in prison for the murders of 17 young men and boys. Though diagnosed with several mental disorders, the jury rejected his insanity plea. Dahmer expressed remorse during his trial, stating he had no desire for freedom and accepted that his actions were monstrous. On November 28, 1994, Dahmer was killed by fellow inmate Christopher Scarver at the Columbia Correctional Institution in Wisconsin. Scarver, disturbed by Dahmer's morbid behavior in prison, fatally beat him with a metal bar, bringing an end to one of America's most infamous serial killers. Ted Bundy was a notorious serial killer responsible for the deaths of at least 30 women during the 1970s, though many believe his actual victim count could be much higher. Known for his charm and good looks, Bundy used these traits to lure victims, making his eventual capture and trial a media sensation. He was executed in 1989 for his crimes. Born on November 24, 1946 in Burlington, Vermont, Bundy's early life was marked by family secrecy. His mother, Eleanor Cowell, was unmarried at his birth, so he was raised by his grandparents, believing his mother was his sister. The identity of Bundy's father remains uncertain. In 1951, Bundy and his mother moved to Tacoma, Washington, where she married Johnny Bundy. Though Bundy took his stepfather's last name, he resented him. From a young age, Bundy exhibited troubling behaviors, including a fascination with knives. He was intelligent, but struggled socially and began spying on women and stealing. After graduating with a degree in psychology from the University of Washington, Bundy briefly attended law school. He dated Diane Edwards, whose eventual breakup left a lasting impact. Many of Bundy's victims resembled her, young women with long, dark hair. By the mid-1970s, Bundy had begun his killing spree. He often lured women by feigning injury before raping and murdering them. He is believed to have started killing in 1974, but some experts suggest he may have started much earlier. His murders span multiple states, and his pattern of behavior became more violent and methodical over time. Elizabeth Klopfer, Bundy's girlfriend from 1969 to 1975, played a key role in his eventual capture. Klopfer grew suspicious of Bundy's behavior, and after multiple instances, reported him to the police. However, Bundy's charm allowed him to evade suspicion for some time. Eventually, in 1975, Bundy was arrested for the attempted kidnapping of Carol Durant, one of the few victims to escape. In 1977, Bundy escaped from custody twice. After his second escape, he made his way to Florida, where he committed the infamous Chi Omega sorority house murders, killing Margaret Bowman and Lisa Levy. His final known victim was 12-year-old Kimberly Leach, whom he kidnapped and killed in 1978. Bundy was captured shortly after. Bundy's trial captivated the public, with his charm and self-representation in court drawing attention. Despite his efforts, he was convicted and sentenced to death for the Chi Omega murders and the murder of Kimberly Leach. In 1980, during his trial, Bundy married Carol Ann Boone, a former co-worker, and fathered a daughter with her while on death row. Boone later divorced him after accepting his guilt. On January 24, 1989, Bundy was executed via electric chair at Florida State Prison. Crowds gathered outside the prison to celebrate, chanting and setting off fireworks. In his final hours, Bundy reportedly wept and expressed remorse during an interview with religious broadcaster James Dobson. His last words were, "Give my love to my family and friends." Charles Manson, the infamous leader of the Manson family, orchestrated a series of brutal murders in the late 1960s, including the horrific killing of pregnant actress Sharon Tate. Though he did not personally commit the murders, his manipulation and control over his followers led to his 1971 conviction and death sentence, later commuted to life in prison. Manson died of natural causes in 2017 at the age of 83. Born on November 12, 1934 in Cincinnati, Manson had a troubled childhood. His mother, a teenage alcoholic and prostitute, married, but the union quickly ended, leaving Manson in and out of juvenile detention centers. By age 12, he had turned to petty crime and spent much of his youth and early adulthood behind bars. Manson's psychological reports from this time described him as unstable and unpredictable. In the late 1960s, Manson gathered a group of devoted followers, mostly young women, who became known as the Manson family. They were drawn to his charisma, drug-fueled lifestyle, and bizarre beliefs, including his prophecy of an impending race war, which he called Helter Skelter, inspired by a Beatles song. Manson envisioned himself as a messianic leader who would guide the world through this chaos. The family lived on a ranch in California, where their ideology grew increasingly extreme and led to a series of violent murders. The Manson family is believed to have committed around 35 murders, though only a few were prosecuted. The most infamous took place over 2 nights in August 1969. Manson ordered his followers, Tex Watson, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Linda Kasabian, to kill everyone in a house rented by director Roman Polanski, who was away. They brutally murdered 5 people, including Polanski's wife, Sharon Tate, who was 8 months pregnant. The following night, Manson led another group to kill Leno and Rosemary LaBianca in similarly savage fashion. Although Manson did not directly participate in the killings, his role as the mastermind led to his conviction. His trial became a media spectacle, where he carved an X into his forehead, later turning it into a swastika, and showed no remorse. The trial captivated the nation, and Manson's eerie charisma and influence over his followers fascinated and horrified the public. The Manson family wasn't immediately arrested for the murders, but for vandalism in Death Valley. A confession by one of the cult members eventually led the police to uncover their involvement in the killings. Manson continued to maintain followers even from behind bars and planned to marry a young admirer in the 2010s, underscoring his lingering influence. Manson spent 46 years in prison before dying in 2017. His death did not mark the end of his notoriety, as legal battles over his body and estate continued. John Wayne Gacy, one of America's most notorious serial killers, led a double life as a well-liked businessman and politician while committing heinous crimes as Pogo the Clown. Behind his friendly public persona, Gacy preyed on vulnerable young men, murdering at least 33 victims, most of whom he buried beneath his home. His chilling story shocked the nation, particularly the disturbing image of a killer dressed as a clown, contributing to widespread fear and distrust of clowns as once harmless entertainers. Gacy was born on March 17, 1942, in Chicago, into a troubled household. His father, a strict, traditional man, frequently criticized and physically abused him, while his mother provided love and protection. Despite this, Gacy's childhood was marked by emotional and physical abuse, leading him to repress his feelings and creating deep insecurities, especially around his gender and sexuality. This repression played a significant role in shaping his dark tendencies. After struggling through school due to a heart condition and social difficulties, Gacy moved to Springfield, Illinois, where he worked as a shoe salesman and entered politics. He married Marlon Myers, whose family had political connections, giving him the appearance of a successful family man. However, Gacy's personal life was far from ideal. He engaged in extramarital affairs and struggled with his sexual identity. In 1968, Gacy's criminal behavior caught up with him when he was convicted of assaulting a teenage boy. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison but was released after just 16 months for good behavior. Upon his release, Gacy moved back to Chicago, remarried, and appeared to rebuild his life, starting a construction business and re-engaging in politics. However, his violent tendencies resurfaced. Gacy created the Pogo the Clown persona, performing at local events to maintain his outward charm while using it as a cover to lure and murder young men. He lured his victims with promises of work or parties, then tortured, whipped, and killed them, burying their bodies in the crawl space beneath his house. His gruesome crimes went unnoticed for years. In 1978, Gacy's crimes were finally exposed when a 15-year-old boy named Robert Piest went missing. Police linked his disappearance to Gacy and, upon searching his home, discovered the decomposing bodies of Gacy's victims. He was arrested and charged with 33 murders, the most victims ever attributed to one individual at the time. During his trial, Gacy attempted to plead insanity, but was found fully competent and sentenced to death. He was executed by lethal injection in 1994. In 1888, London's East End, particularly Whitechapel, was a place of immense poverty, crime, and overcrowded living conditions. Amidst this backdrop, a string of horrific murders would grip not only the local community, but the world at large. The killer would come to be known as Jack the Ripper. The terror began on August 31, 1888, when Charles Cross discovered the body of Mary Ann Nichols, also known as Polly, in Bucks Row. Initially, passers-by did not realize the severity of her injuries due to poor lighting. However, upon police examination, it was revealed that Nichols had been brutally murdered, her throat deeply cut, and her body savagely wounded. Her death would mark the first of the canonical 5 victims linked to Jack the Ripper. The second victim, Annie Chapman, was found on September 8, 1888, in a similar state of mutilation, with organs removed in what seemed to be a precise and skilled manner. This led to theories that the killer possessed medical knowledge, though this idea would later be contested. The horrific mutilations and the removal of organs suggested a killer with deep-seated rage and perhaps some anatomical understanding. As the investigation unfolded, the police were inundated with letters from the public, many of which claimed to be from the killer. One letter in particular, dubbed the Dear Boss letter, would give the murderer his infamous name, Jack the Ripper. Signed by Jack the Ripper, the letter mocked the police and hinted at further violence to come. This fueled public hysteria. The Ripper's most gruesome murder occurred on November 9, 1888, when Mary Jane Kelly, a young Irish woman, was found in her lodging at Miller's Court. Her body was so horrifically mutilated that it was barely recognizable. Unlike the other victims, Kelly had been killed in her home, giving the killer privacy and time to carry out an unthinkable level of violence. Despite the police's best efforts, led by Detective Inspector Frederick Aberline, the Ripper was never caught. Thousands of people were questioned and multiple suspects were pursued, but the case remained unsolved. One critical clue was found after the murder of Catherine Eddowes, another victim of the Ripper. A piece of her apron, soaked in blood, was found near graffiti that read, "The Jewies are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." Fearing that the message would incite anti-Semitic violence, Police Commissioner Charles Warren ordered the graffiti to be erased before it could be properly examined. Theories about Jack the Ripper's identity abound to this day. Some suspected a local man named Aaron Kosminski, a Polish barber who was later committed to an asylum. Others have pointed to George Chapman, a convicted poisoner, or Montague Druitt, whose family suspected him of the crimes. Modern DNA analysis has hinted at Kosminski, but the results have been widely disputed. Despite the endless speculation, the identity of Jack the Ripper remains one of the most enduring mysteries in criminal history. David Berkowitz, known as the infamous Son of Sam, had a turbulent early life that set the stage for the series of murders that would grip New York City in fear. Born Richard David Falco on June 1, 1953, to Betty Broder, his biological father, Joseph Kleinman, pressured her to give him up for adoption. Just days after his birth, he was adopted by Nathan and Pearl Berkowitz, a middle-aged Jewish couple from the Bronx. Despite Pearl's doting care, Nathan remained emotionally distant, leading to a childhood filled with alienation and instability. David was a troubled and hyperactive child, often getting into mischief and bullying others. His behavior began to escalate after he was struck by a car at age 7, sustaining head injuries. He developed a fascination with fire, which started with burning insects and later turned into setting small fires around his neighborhood. Despite alarming signs, including his parents' decision to seek therapy for him, no serious intervention occurred. At age 14, David suffered the devastating loss of his adoptive mother, Pearl, to breast cancer. Her death deepened his emotional turmoil and further strained his relationship with his adoptive father, especially after Nathan remarried. The sense of isolation that followed Pearl's death pushed Berkowitz into a more alienated existence, constructing a fantasy world that helped him cope with the growing emotional void. Seeking structure, Berkowitz enlisted in the Army in 1971, where he performed well and even earned the status of marksman. However, after his honorable discharge in 1974, his antisocial behavior escalated. Living alone in the Bronx, he reconnected briefly with his biological mother and half-sister, but severed ties after discovering the truth about his adoption. This event, combined with his growing obsession with fire and the occult, marked a turning point. He began setting thousands of fires across New York City, recording them meticulously in a journal under the alias The Phantom of the Bronx. By 1975, Berkowitz became convinced that he was under the influence of demonic forces, particularly through the barking of dogs. His delusion led him to believe that these dogs were commanding him to kill. His violent tendencies initially manifested in stabbing 2 women in late 1975, both of whom survived. Feeling knives were inefficient, he armed himself with a .44 caliber revolver and in 1976 began a spree of shootings that would paralyze New York City. His first murder occurred on July 29, 1976, when he shot and killed Donna Loria and wounded her friend Jody Valenti while they sat in a parked car. This marked the beginning of his reign of terror, targeting couples late at night. The randomness of his attacks and his preference for young women with long, dark hair spread panic across the city, causing women to cut or dye their hair in hopes of avoiding his wrath. Berkowitz taunted the police and the public with chilling letters, signing them Son of Sam. He claimed to be under the control of a monster and on a mission to kill. His cryptic language and brazen attitude toward law enforcement captured the media's attention, further stoking the public's fear. The Son of Sam saga continued into 1977, with Berkowitz killing more victims in brutal, seemingly random attacks. However, his reign came to an end after a neighbor, Cecilia Davis, provided a crucial tip that led investigators to his car, which had been ticketed the night of one of the murders. On August 10, 1977, Berkowitz was arrested. Inside his car, police found a rifle and incriminating evidence, including a letter. Berkowitz confessed to the murders and later pled guilty to 6 counts of murder, declining an insanity defense. His conviction marked the end of one of the most infamous killing sprees in American history. In the aftermath, Son of Sam laws were enacted to prevent criminals from profiting from their crimes through media deals. Though Berkowitz remains in prison, his legacy as the Son of Sam endures, with his case continuing to be studied for its psychological, social, and criminal implications. The Zodiac Killer's legacy remains one of the most haunting mysteries in American criminal history. On the chilling night of December 20th, 1968, two high school sweethearts, David Arthur Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen, became his first known victims. Their murder on a secluded stretch of Lake Herman Road in Vallejo, California, was the beginning of a series of violent, taunting, and deeply unsettling acts by a killer who seemed to thrive on both the terror he invoked and the attention he received. The Zodiac's attacks followed a brutal pattern. He targeted young couples in isolated areas, often in or near their vehicles. In the second known incident, on July 4th, 1969, Michael Mageau and Darlene Ferrin were ambushed at Blue Rock Springs Park. The killer, wielding a flashlight and posing as a police officer, shot them both. Darlene died, but Michael survived, providing a description of the killer. In a chilling twist, the Zodiac himself called the police to claim responsibility for the murder, linking it to the 1968 attack. The Zodiac's cryptic letters to the press elevated him from a shadowy figure to a public menace. His letters contained codes and ciphers that hinted at his identity, but these often provided more frustration than clues. The first cipher was cracked by amateur codebreakers Donald and Betty Harden, revealing his disturbing motivations but giving no clue to his identity. In September 1969, the Zodiac evolved from attacks to a horrifying stabbing at Lake Berryessa, where Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard were bound and attacked. While Hartnell survived, Shepard succumbed to her injuries. The Zodiac left his mark, scrawling a message on Hartnell's car door that listed his prior murders and included his now iconic crosshair symbol. 2 weeks later, the Zodiac struck in San Francisco, killing cab driver Paul Stine. This marked a shift in his methods and suggested he was capable of evolving his tactics. Witnesses saw a man matching the Zodiac's description fleeing the scene, but despite this, he continued to evade capture. Taunting the police and public through letters, the Zodiac even included a piece of Stine's bloodied shirt in his correspondence. The Zodiac relished in his infamy, sending over 20 letters filled with cryptic messages, boasts, and threats. One of his most chilling threats was to target schoolchildren, claiming he could pick them off by shooting the tires of a school bus. This instigated mass panic, though the threat was never carried out. While Paul Stine is considered the Zodiac's last confirmed victim, he claimed to have killed 37 people. His communications with the media continued for years, the last of which came in 1974, but the authenticity of some later letters is still debated. Despite extensive investigation, the Zodiac's true identity remains elusive. Arthur Lee Allen emerged as the prime suspect, and while evidence pointed toward him, like his possession of a Zodiac-branded watch and similar physical traits, the case against him was never definitively proven. DNA tests conducted on stamps used by the Zodiac were inconclusive, leaving Allen's involvement unconfirmed before his death in 1992. The unsolved nature of the Zodiac case has spawned countless theories and suspects. Amateur sleuths have suggested links to other notorious criminals like the Unabomber, while others claim that the Zodiac might be a relative or an entirely unknown figure. The unsolved ciphers, especially the Z340, continue to tantalize cryptographers and investigators, who wonder if they hold the key to finally identifying the killer. Richard Ramirez, infamously known as the Night Stalker, was one of America's most notorious serial killers, responsible for a wave of terror across California in the mid-1980s. Born in El Paso, Texas in 1960, Ramirez's early life was marred by trauma, including severe head injuries and a deeply troubling influence from his older cousin, a Vietnam War veteran who exposed him to tales and images of horrific violence. By his teenage years, Ramirez had already begun a descent into drug addiction, petty crime, and a disturbing fascination with Satanism. His criminal activities escalated dramatically in 1984 when he committed his first known murder, brutally killing 79-year-old Jenny Vinkow during a burglary. Over the next year, Ramirez embarked on a horrific spree, marked by at least 14 murders and countless other assaults, often characterized by extreme violence and satanic rituals. His victims ranged from young women to elderly couples, and his methods were as varied as they were brutal, including shooting, stabbing, and bludgeoning. Ramirez's reign of terror culminated in his capture on August 31, 1985, after a series of slip-ups, including leaving a footprint at a crime scene and being recognized by members of the public. His trial, which began in 1988, drew widespread attention, not only for the gruesome nature of his crimes, but also for his bizarre behavior in court, where he often displayed satanic symbols and showed no remorse for his actions. Ramirez was eventually convicted on 43 charges, including 13 counts of murder, and was sentenced to death. Despite his horrific crimes, Ramirez attracted a cult following, including Doreen Lioy, who married him while he was on death row. He spent nearly 24 years in San Quentin prison, where he ultimately died of complications from cancer in 2013 at the age of 53. His life and crimes have been the subject of various media portrayals, including a Netflix documentary that sought to shed light on the investigation that brought him to justice, rather than glorify the killer himself. Henry Lee Lucas was a notorious criminal, remembered for claiming responsibility for hundreds of killings during the 1960s and 70s, although only 3, including his mother, were ever verified. He was born on August 23, 1936, in Blacksburg, Virginia, into a difficult home with abusive and alcoholic parents. His mother had a dominant personality and made money through questionable means, which deeply affected Lucas as he grew up. By his teenage years, he exhibited troubling behavior. In 1960, Lucas was convicted for the tragic death of his mother, earning a 20 to 40-year prison sentence. After serving 10 years, he was paroled in 1970, though he struggled to stay out of trouble. He was sent back to prison in 1971 for attempting to take a 15-year-old girl by force, but was released again in 1975. During this time, Lucas partnered with a petty criminal named Otis Toole, and they developed an unhealthy fascination with violence. Along with Toole's niece, Becky Powell, they traveled across the country. Although Lucas claimed to have developed a close relationship with Powell, he later ended her life, as well as that of an elderly woman they had been staying with, Catherine Rich. In 1983, Lucas was arrested for carrying a dangerous weapon. While in custody, he began confessing to an alarming number of crimes, though many of these claims lacked evidence. Despite his confessions, most experts believe he was only responsible for 3 confirmed deaths. He was sentenced to death, but Texas Governor George W. Bush later commuted the sentence to life in prison. While on death row, Lucas embraced religion and became a born-again Christian, spending his final 18 years as a model prisoner. He passed away from natural causes on March 12, 2001, in a Texas prison at the age of 64. Edmund Kemper, infamously known as the Co-Ed Killer, is a notorious criminal responsible for a series of brutal murders, including the lives of 6 young women and members of his own family during the 1970s. His crimes shocked the nation, revealing a complex and disturbing psyche that left a lasting mark on criminal history. Born on December 18, 1948, in Burbank, California, Kemper had a troubled upbringing. After his parents divorced, he moved to Montana with his mother, Clarnell, and 2 sisters. His relationship with Clarnell was fraught with emotional abuse, as she often berated and belittled him. She feared his growing size and dark tendencies, forcing him to live in the basement at the age of 10, fearing he would harm his sisters. From a young age, Kemper displayed signs of deep emotional and psychological issues. He exhibited disturbing behaviors such as violent games, harming animals, and harboring dark thoughts. Fearing for her safety and that of her family, Clarnell sent him to live with his grandparents in North Fork, California. At the age of 15, Kemper's suppressed anger exploded into violence. On August 27, 1964, after an argument, Kemper shot and killed his grandmother in a fit of rage. When his grandfather returned home, Kemper fatally shot him as well, later explaining that he did not want his grandfather to suffer the shock of discovering his wife's body. After the murders, Kemper called his mother and subsequently turned himself in to the authorities. Following his arrest, Kemper was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and sent to Atascadero State Hospital, a maximum security facility for mentally ill offenders. Despite his diagnosis, he was considered highly intelligent and manipulative, gaining the trust of doctors who believed he had improved. In 1969, at the age of 21, he was released, despite recommendations that he not return to live with his mother. Against professional advice, Kemper returned to Santa Cruz to live with Clarnell. Despite their tumultuous relationship, he tried to reintegrate into society by holding several jobs and even attempting to join the state police, only to be rejected due to his imposing size, 6 feet 9 inches tall and weighing nearly 300 pounds. This earned him the nickname Big Ed. During this time, Kemper developed an unsettling habit of picking up female hitchhikers. Initially, he would release them unharmed, but by 1972, his fantasies turned deadly. His first known victims were Marianne Pesce and Anita Lucchesa, 2 college students whom he picked up, murdered, and dismembered. This marked the beginning of a year-long killing spree where he targeted hitchhikers, all young women, and carefully planned out his attacks to avoid detection. In April 1973, Kemper's violent impulses reached their tragic peak when he murdered his mother, Clarnell, during a heated argument. While she slept, he bludgeoned and strangled her, then mutilated her body in a grotesque manner that revealed his deep-seated hatred toward her. Following the murder, Kemper called his mother's friend, Sally Hallett, to come to the house, where he killed her as well. Afterward, he fled to Colorado, where he called the police and confessed to his crimes, including the murders of 6 young women. In October 1973, Kemper was charged with 8 counts of first-degree murder. He was found guilty and sentenced to 8 life sentences without the possibility of parole. He is currently incarcerated at the California Medical Facility in Vacaville, where he has become a model prisoner, assisting in various projects, including narrating books for the blind. Ed Gein, often dubbed the Butcher of Plainfield, is one of the most infamous criminals in American history. His grisly crimes shocked the small town of Plainfield, Wisconsin, and reverberated far beyond. His legacy became intertwined with popular culture, inspiring some of the most iconic characters in horror cinema, such as Norman Bates in Psycho, Leatherface in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and Buffalo Bill in The Silence of the Lambs. But behind the fictional adaptations lies a story of extreme psychological trauma, isolation, and madness. Born on August 27, 1906, in La Crosse, Wisconsin, he grew up in an intensely dysfunctional family. His father, George, was an alcoholic, and his mother, Augusta, a domineering and fanatically religious woman, controlled nearly every aspect of Ed's upbringing. Augusta preached strict moral values, particularly condemning women as agents of sin and corruption, and kept her sons, Ed and his older brother, Henry, isolated from outside influences. In 1915, the family moved to a remote farm near Plainfield, Wisconsin, where Ed would spend the rest of his life in seclusion. Ed's attachment to his mother became a defining aspect of his life, as she dominated him emotionally, shaping his beliefs and behavior. He rarely ventured off the farm, except to attend school, where his social awkwardness and unusual behavior made him a target of bullying. His mother's oppressive influence stifled any meaningful relationships with peers, especially women. In 1940, Ed's father died, leaving Ed and Henry to support the family. The 2 brothers worked odd jobs around Plainfield, earning a reputation as reliable, albeit eccentric, laborers. However, in 1944, Henry died under suspicious circumstances during a brush-clearing fire. Although the death was officially ruled accidental, some have speculated that Ed may have been involved, especially given his later behavior. The most significant turning point in Ed's life came in 1945, when Augusta passed away after suffering a series of strokes. Her death devastated Ed, and he became increasingly isolated. He kept her bedroom in immaculate condition as a shrine, while the rest of the house descended into squalor. With her gone, Ed turned inward, fixating on dark interests such as anatomy and death, which he fed through books on the human body and tales of Nazi atrocities. Ed's crimes first came to light in 1957, after the disappearance of Bernice Worden, the owner of a local hardware store. Her son, Frank Worden, a deputy sheriff, suspected Ed, who had been at the store earlier that day. When authorities searched his farmhouse, they uncovered horrors beyond imagination. Inside, they found Bernice Worden's body hanging in a shed, mutilated in a manner reminiscent of a hunting kill. But the discoveries in the house were even more disturbing. Authorities found human skulls used as bowls, lampshades made of human skin, masks and clothing stitched together from human remains, and a suit made from a woman's torso, which he allegedly wore. These macabre items were not the result of numerous murders, however. He admitted to exhuming corpses from local graveyards to create his morbid trophies. He confessed to killing 2 women, Bernice Worden and Mary Hogan, a local tavern owner who had gone missing in 1954, but it remains uncertain if he was responsible for other unsolved disappearances in the area. After his arrest, he was declared legally insane and committed to Central State Hospital for the criminally insane in Waupun, Wisconsin. He was later found competent to stand trial in 1968 for the murder of Bernice Worden, but was again judged insane at the time of the crime. He spent the remainder of his life in mental institutions, where he was considered a model patient, quiet, compliant, and non-threatening. He died in 1984 from complications related to cancer. Snowtown, nestled among South Australia's farmlands, was an ordinary rural town until May 20, 1999, when police investigating several disappearances were led to a disused bank. Inside, they discovered 6 plastic barrels filled with human remains. Forensic examinations soon revealed that 8 people had been brutally murdered. The gruesome nature of these crimes was made even more shocking by the fact that they had been carried out by a group of 4 men, rather than a lone killer. The orchestrator behind these crimes was John Bunting, a man who preyed on others to carry out his twisted agenda. Born in Queensland in 1966, Bunting had a disturbing history of violent tendencies and manipulative behavior. He was driven by a delusional belief that certain people deserved to die, compiling a list of individuals he believed were dangerous or corrupt, often based on nothing more than rumors. Bunting was not alone in his crimes. His closest accomplice, Robert Wagner, shared his distorted vision and acted with equal brutality. Wagner, born in 1971, embraced Bunting's warped justification for their violent spree, which claimed the lives of people they knew, friends, acquaintances, and even family members. James Vlasakis, Bunting's stepson, was drawn into the killings at a young age, emotionally vulnerable and easily manipulated by Bunting. Born in 1979, Vlasakis was coerced into committing horrific acts exploited by Bunting's influence. Mark Hayden, born in 1958, had a lesser, though still chilling role in the group. Though he didn't directly participate in the murders, he helped conceal the evidence, including the remains of his own wife. His involvement underscored the control Bunting exerted over his followers, pushing them to abandon moral boundaries. The victims, many of whom were part of the killer's social circle, were targeted for reasons ranging from personal vendettas to sheer convenience. In addition to the murders, the group profited financially from their victims by stealing personal information and pocketing tens of thousands of dollars in fraudulent gains. The discovery of the bodies led to the arrests of Bunting, Wagner, Vlasakis, and Hayden. Though only one of the murders occurred in Snowtown, the name of the town would forever be tied to the case. The trial, the longest in South Australia's history, revealed the full extent of the group's cruelty. John Bunting was sentenced to 11 life terms without parole, while Robert Wagner received 10 consecutive life sentences. James Vlasakis, who cooperated with authorities, was sentenced to 4 life terms, and Mark Hayden received 25 years for his role in concealing the crimes. During the late 1970s, Northern England faced terror as a brutal serial killer, later named the Yorkshire Ripper, shocked the country. On October 30, 1975, Wilma McCann, a 28-year-old mother of 4, was found bludgeoned and stabbed near her Leeds home. Her death launched an extensive police investigation, but early biases about her lifestyle, speculating involvement in prostitution, led to delays and more victims. The second victim, Emily Jackson, was murdered in January 1976, attacked with a hammer and stabbed over 50 times. A boot print left at the scene became a significant clue, but the focus on linking the murders to sex work continued, shaping police theories. This narrow perspective persisted until the killer changed his pattern, leaving more clues that were often misinterpreted. In February 1977, Irene Richardson, another woman involved in prostitution, was killed. Despite finding tire tracks at the scene, investigators failed to capitalize on the lead. Patricia Tina Atkinson was murdered next in April, this time inside her apartment, shifting the killer's method. However, police still clung to the theory that his motive was hatred for sex workers. The case took a dark turn in June 1977 when 16-year-old Jane McDonald was murdered. She wasn't involved in prostitution, and her death shattered the public's perception that only vulnerable women were at risk. This led to growing protests, such as the Reclaim the Night marches, where women demanded safer streets. Despite these developments, the killer, Peter Sutcliffe, remained elusive. In 1978, Sutcliffe continued his rampage. Two women, Yvonne Pearson and Helen Ritka, were murdered in January, but Pearson's body wasn't discovered until months later. Around the same time, the police received letters claiming to be from the killer, further fueling the belief that the murderer hated prostitutes. These letters led investigators down a misleading path that distracted them from other critical leads. In 1979, Sutcliffe sent an audio tape to police, using a Geordie accent to taunt them. This further convinced investigators that the killer was from Sunderland, leading to a massive public appeal to identify the voice. Despite surviving victims claiming the killer had a Yorkshire accent, police dismissed these assertions. Throughout this time, Sutcliffe continued his killing spree. His final known victims were Jacqueline Hill and Marguerite Walls in 1980. Sutcliffe was finally captured in 1981, not due to any major investigative breakthrough, but because police stopped him for a minor offense. When they searched his car, they found the murder weapons he had discarded. Sutcliffe's arrest exposed serious flaws in the investigation, as he had been interviewed multiple times before, but was overlooked due to police fixation on the misleading clues, such as the false Geordie accent. He was sentenced to life in prison for his crimes, and died in 2020 after contracting COVID-19. So this entry is going to sound very vague, but basically it was their daughter who told police what her parents did to her, which led to them being caught. And I can't really tell what Fred and Rena did, but you'll probably be able to fill in the details while I tell it. Fred West was a British man born on September 29, 1941, in the small town of Muchmarcle, Herefordshire. He grew up in a working-class family and experienced a challenging childhood marked by strict parental discipline and financial hardship. As a young man, Fred struggled to find his place in the world and faced numerous difficulties, including leaving school at an early age to work. In the 1960s, Fred moved to Gloucester, where he began to build a life for himself. He had a variety of jobs, but eventually found work as a builder. This trade allowed him to develop practical skills that would later play a role in his life. During this time, he also met and married his first wife, Rena Costello, and together they had several children. However, the marriage was fraught with challenges, leading to its eventual dissolution. Following the end of his first marriage, Fred met Rose West in 1969. The couple quickly became partners in both life and work, often seen renovating homes and operating a small boarding house together. They became well known in their community and seemed to have a typical family life. Fred and Rose had several children together, and they were often described as a close-knit family. However, beneath the surface, Fred's life began to take a darker turn. In the 1970s, police began to investigate Fred and Rose due to suspicions regarding the sudden disappearances of young individuals connected to them. Despite these investigations, Fred managed to evade serious scrutiny for several years, maintaining a seemingly normal existence. As the investigation continued, it became clear that there were significant issues within Fred and Rose's household. Many of the families of the missing individuals expressed deep concerns about the couple's activities. The police conducted numerous inquiries but faced challenges in gathering concrete evidence. In 1994, following years of investigation, police made a significant breakthrough when they discovered disturbing evidence related to the couple. This discovery led to a more thorough investigation into their activities. Fred and Rose were arrested, and the case quickly became one of the most high-profile criminal investigations in British history. As the legal proceedings unfolded, the public was captivated by the details of the case. The couple's actions shocked the nation and raised questions about societal dynamics and the nature of relationships. Fred was charged with multiple offenses, and the legal process revealed a complex story of his life and relationships. Fred West was ultimately convicted in 1995. However, he did not stand trial for his actions, as he died in prison under tragic circumstances. His death left many questions unanswered, and it marked the end of a highly publicized case that had captured the attention of the nation. The Boston Strangler, responsible for a series of 13 murders in Boston, terrorized the city starting in 1962. The first victim, 55-year-old Anna Slessers, was found strangled with her bathrobe belt. The victims, ranging from 19 to 85, were all women, mostly living alone. The killer often gained entry without signs of forced entry, leading police to believe he posed as someone trustworthy. Strangulation with items from the victims' homes was his method, and fear spread as women grew increasingly afraid to be alone. In 1964, Albert DeSalvo, a convicted rapist, confessed to the murders while already imprisoned for sexual assaults known as the Green Man crimes. DeSalvo's detailed confessions included unreleased details about the murders, but inconsistencies in his accounts led many to doubt his claim. Some suspected DeSalvo sought notoriety, and without solid forensic evidence, he was never tried for the murders. Instead, DeSalvo was sentenced to life for his crimes and was later stabbed to death in his cell in 1973, leaving the case unresolved. The Boston Strangler case was notorious for its forensic challenges. In the 1960s, investigative tools were limited, with no DNA testing, and the police relied on fingerprinting and blood typing. Investigators couldn't find physical evidence, like fingerprints or fibers, directly linking DeSalvo to the crime scenes. This lack of evidence cast doubt on whether he was truly the killer or if someone else might have been responsible for some or all of the murders. In 2013, DNA analysis finally linked DeSalvo to Mary Sullivan, one of the Strangler's victims, confirming his involvement in at least one murder. Despite this breakthrough, questions lingered about the other 12 killings. Albert Fish was one of the most unsettling figures in early 20th century crime. Born in 1870, he came from a troubled background and experienced severe hardships growing up. Fish spent part of his childhood in an orphanage, where he faced difficult circumstances that greatly influenced his behavior later in life. By his teenage years, he had developed unusual interests and behaviors, which set him on a dark path. Fish led an outwardly ordinary life, marrying and having 6 children, yet privately he began to exhibit increasingly concerning tendencies. By the 1920s, he had become notorious for his strange and unsettling activities, often targeting vulnerable individuals. His behavior included acts that were both inappropriate and harmful, causing significant distress to those involved. One of the most infamous events in his life was the 1928 disappearance of a young girl named Grace Budd. Fish had approached the Budd family under a false identity, claiming to offer a job to Grace's brother. Instead, he convinced them to allow Grace to accompany him on an outing, but she was never seen again. Years later, a letter from Fish to the Budd family revealed his role in the incident, leading to his eventual capture. Fish was arrested in 1934, and during his trial in 1935, it became clear that he struggled with serious psychological issues. The court case garnered widespread attention due to its shocking nature, and Fish's behavior in the courtroom further cemented his legacy as a deeply troubled individual. Despite arguments about his mental state, he was found guilty and sentenced to death in 1936, ending one of the darkest chapters in American crime history. So I cannot tell you everything he did, but basically X-rays showed he placed needles inside his pelvis because somehow this gave him satisfaction, like, this is totally normal, and he also just consumed people who were in their early years. The DC sniper attacks began on October 2, 2002, with the shooting of James Martin in Maryland, followed by 5 more deaths in the next 24 hours. The attacks, carried out in public places like gas stations and parking lots, were random, sparking widespread fear across the Washington, D.C. area. The victims varied in age, race, and occupation, making it difficult for investigators to find a motive. Schools went on high alert, public events were canceled, and residents were too scared to go outside. Law enforcement agencies, including the FBI and ATF, teamed up to track the elusive snipers, but early investigations yielded few leads. The shooters, later revealed to be John Allen Muhammad, a 41-year-old Gulf War veteran, and 17-year-old Lee Boyd Malvo, used a modified Chevrolet Caprice with a small hole in the trunk, allowing them to shoot undetected. Muhammad, who had financial struggles and personal grievances, manipulated Malvo into helping carry out the attacks. Their motive was complex, as Muhammad planned to extort the government and settle personal scores, while Malvo, deeply influenced by Muhammad, saw the attacks as part of a greater mission. A key breakthrough came when Malvo's fingerprints, found on a magazine, linked him to the crime scenes. A tip from a citizen later led to the duo's capture on October 24, 2002. Muhammad was sentenced to death and executed in 2009, while Malvo, a minor during the attacks, was sentenced to life without parole. His case has since been revisited due to changing legal views on juvenile sentencing, but he remains incarcerated. Aileen Carol Wuornos was born on February 29, 1956, in Rochester, Michigan. From an early age, her life was shaped by abuse and neglect. Her father was a convicted sex offender who committed suicide, while her mother abandoned her when she was just 4 years old. Raised by her abusive grandparents, Aileen endured years of physical, emotional, and sexual abuse at the hands of her grandfather. By the time she was a teenager, Wuornos had turned to prostitution, engaging in sexual activities to trade for basic needs. At 14, she became pregnant, allegedly after being raped by a family friend, and gave birth to a child who was put up for adoption. Wuornos soon left her grandparents' home and began a life of crime, engaging in petty theft and work. Her troubled early adulthood was marked by violence, and she was frequently arrested. In 1976, she briefly married an older man, but her violent behavior led to a quick annulment. Between 1989 and 1990, Wuornos embarked on a killing spree that left 7 men dead. Posing as a hitchhiker or prostitute, she would lure her victims, then shoot them at close range, rob them, and leave their bodies in isolated locations. Her victims ranged in age, and while Wuornos claimed self-defense in some cases, the consistency of her methods suggested otherwise. The first victim, Richard Mallory, was killed in November 1989, and his murder set off a spree that continued into 1990, with victims including David Spears, Charles Carskadden, Peter Seams, and others. In January 1991, Wuornos was arrested after being linked to the crimes through evidence like fingerprints. Her romantic partner, Thierry Amour, cooperated with the police, which led to a confession from Wuornos. Despite pleading self-defense, Wuornos was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death for multiple crimes. Aileen spent her final years on death row, where her mental health deteriorated. She became increasingly paranoid and erratic, eventually refusing to appeal her sentences. She was executed by lethal injection on October 9, 2002. Her story remains controversial, with some viewing her as a cold-blooded killer and others as a victim of her tragic upbringing. H. Holmes, born Herman Webster Mudgett on May 16, 1861, in Gilmanton, New Hampshire, is often regarded as America's first serial killer. From a young age, he exhibited an unusual interest in death and dissection, behaviors that hinted at his future criminal tendencies. His intelligence and interest in medicine led him to the University of Michigan, where he honed his anatomical skills. However, he also began committing insurance fraud by using cadavers to fake accidents and claim payouts. After graduating in 1884, Mudgett adopted the name H., beginning a new chapter of deceit, traveling across the country, marrying multiple women under false identities, and engaging in various criminal activities. In 1886, Holmes settled in Chicago and built a 3-story structure that would later be known as the Murder Castle. Disguised as a hotel and retail space, the building contained secret passageways, trapdoors, soundproof rooms, and gas chambers designed for killing his victims. Holmes constructed the building in such a way that no single contractor knew its entire layout. He used the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition to lure victims, often women who came to Chicago seeking work, into his castle where few escaped alive. Holmes's motivations for murder were primarily financial. He would often take out life insurance policies on his victims before killing them. His first known victims included Julia Smythe and her daughter Pearl, both of whom vanished under mysterious circumstances. Another victim, Emmeline Sigrand, disappeared after Holmes had promised to marry her. Holmes also killed Minnie Williams and her sister Nanny after convincing Minnie to sign over her property to him. Despite his marriage to Georgiana Yoke, who miraculously survived, Holmes had a habit of marrying and killing women for their wealth. Holmes's downfall came not directly from the murders, but through an insurance scam involving an accomplice, Benjamin Pitezel. Holmes planned to fake Pitezel's death, but instead he killed him and later murdered Pitezel's 3 children. These shocking acts led to his arrest in November 1894. Initially charged with insurance fraud, investigators soon uncovered the full extent of his crimes. Holmes was convicted of Pitezel's murder and sentenced to death. On May 7, 1896, he was hanged, showing no remorse for his actions. Ivan Milat, often referred to as the backpacker murderer, is one of Australia's most infamous serial killers, responsible for a string of brutal murders between 1989 and 1993. His targets were young backpackers traveling through Australia. Marko Milat was born on December 27, 1944, in Guildford, New South Wales, to a large Croatian immigrant family. As the 5th of 14 children, he grew up in a household known for its strict discipline and dysfunction. Violence was reportedly common in the Milat family, which likely contributed to Ivan's troubled development. Milat's delinquent behavior began early, marked by rebellion and petty criminal activities such as theft and break-ins. By his mid-teens, he had already had several brushes with the law. Despite these early warning signs, Milat largely managed to avoid significant prison time, which allowed his criminal behavior to escalate unchecked over the years. The murders that earned Milat his notorious nickname began in the late 1980s, targeting young travelers who were hitchhiking through Australia. The country's vast landscapes and isolated roads made backpackers easy targets. The first chilling discoveries occurred in September 1992, when the remains of British tourists Caroline Clark and Joanne Walters were found in the Belanglo State Forest, a remote area southwest of Sydney. Both women had been subjected to extreme violence, with Clark being shot multiple times and Walters stabbed 35 times. The level of brutality suggested the killer took pleasure in inflicting pain. Over the following months, more bodies were found in the same forest. By 1993, the remains of 5 more victims had been unearthed. German travelers Gabor Neugebauer and Anja Habschied, Australians James Gibson and Deborah Everest, and another German backpacker, Simone Schmidl. Each murder revealed disturbing patterns of violence and torture, with most of the victims being either stabbed or shot and left in remote areas. The consistent brutality of the crimes sparked widespread fear, as young travelers were warned against hitchhiking. Milat's killing spree continued for years without resolution, despite extensive police efforts to track down the killer. The investigation, known as Task Force Air, involved one of the most complex and extensive operations in Australian history. A breakthrough occurred in 1994 when a British backpacker, Paul Onions, came forward with a critical piece of evidence. Onions had been hitchhiking in Australia in 1990 when a man named Bill picked him up. During the drive, Onions became suspicious of his driver, and when Bill stopped the car, pulled out a gun, and attempted to abduct him, Onions managed to escape and alert the police. Years later, after hearing about the backpacker murders, Onions realized the man who had tried to abduct him was likely the same person responsible for the murders. Onions' testimony led police to Ivan Milat, whose physical description and history matched the profile of the suspect. After a detailed investigation, Milat was arrested in May 1994. A search of his home revealed damning evidence, including weapons used in the murders and personal belongings of several victims, linking him directly to the crimes. Milat's trial in 1996 was one of the most high-profile cases in Australian history. Despite overwhelming evidence, including the testimony of Paul Onions, Milat maintained his innocence throughout the proceedings. His calm demeanor during the trial stood in stark contrast to the horrific nature of his crimes. The prosecution presented a solid case based on forensic evidence, witness accounts, and Milat's possession of the victim's belongings. Milat's defense tried to shift the blame to other members of his family, suggesting that the evidence was circumstantial and that others could have been involved in the murders. However, the jury found him guilty of all 7 murders. On July 27, 1996, Ivan Milat was sentenced to 7 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. Judge David Hunt described Milat's crimes as among the most appalling in Australian criminal history. Despite the conviction, Milat remained defiant, never confessing to his crimes or providing any closure to the victims' families. While Milat's conviction brought some closure to the families of the 7 known victims, there remains speculation that he may have been responsible for other unsolved murders across Australia, particularly those involving missing hitchhikers. However, Milat refused to cooperate with authorities, and the full extent of his crimes may never be known. Ivan Milat died in 2019 while serving his life sentences, taking with him any secrets about other potential victims. Andrei Chikatilo, dubbed the Butcher of Rostov or the Red Ripper, was one of Russia's most notorious serial killers, responsible for at least 52 murders between 1978 and 1990. His victims were often women and children, and his crimes were marked by brutal mutilation and sexual violence. Born in 1936, Chikatilo's early life was marred by poverty, famine, and rumors that his brother had been eaten by neighbors, events that may have contributed to his violent tendencies. His childhood was filled with social and sexual dysfunction, which fueled his violent fantasies as he grew older. Despite his psychological issues, Chikatilo led a double life, appearing as a family man and working as a school teacher. However, underneath this facade, he lured his victims, often vulnerable individuals, into secluded areas where he would overpower them, sexually assault them, and mutilate their bodies. He derived sexual pleasure from these violent acts, particularly from stabbing and biting his victims. His ability to evade capture was partly due to the inefficiency of Soviet law enforcement and the limitations of forensic technology at the time. Chikatilo was first linked to a murder in 1978, but the police wrongfully convicted and executed another man for the crime. This error allowed him to continue killing for years. The fall of the Soviet Union in the late 1980s contributed to his eventual capture, as greater media scrutiny and public outcry pushed authorities to intensify their efforts. He was arrested in 1990 after being seen acting suspiciously near a train station, a common location for his crimes. Forensic evidence, including samples, eventually tied him to the murders. During his 1992 trial, Chikatilo's bizarre and erratic behavior captivated the public. He was convicted of 52 murders and sentenced to death, ultimately being executed by a gunshot to the head in 1994. His case highlights the failures of Soviet law enforcement, which was slow to acknowledge sexual violence and struggled with outdated investigative methods. The Grim Sleeper, Lonnie David Franklin Jr., was a serial killer whose crimes in South Los Angeles spanned over 2 decades, targeting marginalized women, many of whom were Black, struggling with addiction or involved in work. From 1985 to 2007, Franklin murdered at least 10 women, though the actual number of victims is suspected to be far higher. His nickname, Grim Sleeper, stems from a presumed 14-year hiatus between killings, though evidence suggests this break may not have been real. Franklin's ability to operate for so long without being caught points to systemic failures in law enforcement and society's neglect of marginalized communities. The Los Angeles Police Department, LAPD, faced significant criticism for its slow response, with activists highlighting how little attention was given to the deaths of poor, Black women. What ultimately led to Franklin's arrest in 2010 was the rise of DNA technology, specifically familial DNA searching. Investigators linked evidence from crime scenes to Franklin through his son's DNA. The breakthrough came after years of community pressure and frustration over law enforcement's inaction. When police searched Franklin's home, they found hundreds of disturbing photographs of women, many of whom were unconscious or in compromising positions. These images suggested Franklin's victim count could be far higher than the 10 for which he was convicted. His arrest shocked those who knew him, as Franklin had led an unassuming life as a mechanic in South Los Angeles. Franklin was convicted of 10 murders in 2016 and sentenced to death, though he never admitted guilt. He died in 2020 while on death row, leaving many questions unanswered, particularly regarding the true number of his victims. The Hillside Strangler case is one of the most notorious serial killer stories in American history, involving the brutal murders of 10 women in Los Angeles between 1977 and 1978. Initially, authorities believed a single killer was responsible, but it was later revealed that 2 men, Kenneth Bianchi and his cousin Angelo Buono, had worked together in carrying out these horrifying crimes. The pair lured their victims, many of whom were sex workers or runaways, by posing as police officers before abducting, torturing, and ultimately strangling them. Bianchi and Buono's partnership was deeply disturbing. Buono, the older of the two, was sadistic and domineering, while Bianchi, although less aggressive, sought validation from his cousin. Together, they formed a deadly duo that preyed on women, inflicting unimaginable cruelty. After the women were killed, their bodies were dumped in the hills surrounding Los Angeles, a method that earned the killers the nickname, the Hillside Strangler. The police were initially baffled by the case. The randomness of the murders, the lack of forensic evidence, and the different backgrounds of the victims made it difficult to connect the dots. However, the psychological profile of the killers began to emerge as authorities identified a pattern of dominance and sadism, with the killers deriving pleasure from asserting control over their victims. Bianchi's arrest in 1979 for a failed murder attempt in Washington was a turning point. He attempted to claim that one of his alter egos committed the murders in a bid to escape responsibility, but experts quickly debunked this defense. Under pressure, Bianchi confessed and implicated Buono, unraveling the case. The trials were lengthy and controversial, with Bianchi agreeing to testify against his cousin in exchange for a reduced sentence. Buono was convicted in 1983 of 9 of the murders and sentenced to life without parole. Bianchi, for his cooperation, also received a life sentence. Their trials captivated the nation, not only for the brutality of the crimes, but also for the media frenzy that followed each revelation. The Moores murders, carried out by Ian Brady and Myra Hindley between 1963 and 1965, remain among the most infamous crimes in the UK, largely due to the disturbing nature of the crimes and the young age of the victims. This horrifying series of events unfolded in the Manchester area, where 5 innocent children were lured away by the pair and taken to the desolate Saddleworth Moor. The emotional impact these crimes left on the nation is still felt today. Ian Brady was born in 1938 in Glasgow and had a difficult upbringing. As he grew older, he became intensely interested in ideas surrounding control, power, and darker philosophical concepts. His fascination with these ideas shaped his later actions. Brady's partner in crime, Myra Hindley, was born in Manchester in 1942. She led a more stable early life, but her life took a fateful turn when she met Brady in 1961. Over time, she became captivated by Brady's influence, and her involvement in the crimes followed as she became his close confidant and active participant in his plans. The couple's crimes began in July 1963 with the disappearance of 16-year-old Pauline Reed. Brady and Hindley convinced her to join them on a car ride, taking her to Saddleworth Moor, a remote area that became the setting for their acts. Pauline's remains were hidden in this location, and her case would go unsolved for many years. Not long after Pauline's disappearance, another child, 12-year-old John Kilbride, vanished under similar circumstances. Brady and Hindley again used their cunning to deceive and mislead, taking him to the same remote moorland. His disappearance, like Pauline's, left the community in shock and fear. The authorities struggled to make sense of the disappearances, as no clear connection between the victims was immediately apparent. The pair continued their crimes over the next 2 years with 3 more children, Keith Bennett, 12, Leslie Ann Downey, 10, and Edward Evans, 17, becoming victims. What set these cases apart from others was the methodical and calculating manner in which Brady and Hindley committed their acts. They even documented their crimes, creating troubling evidence that would later play a key role in their trial. Their downfall came in October 1965 when Brady involved Hindley's brother-in-law, David Smith, in their final crime. After witnessing a violent act against their last victim, Edward Evans, Smith fled and informed the police, leading to the couple's arrest. The subsequent investigation uncovered photographs and recordings that linked Brady and Hindley to the missing children. The trial in 1966 was a national sensation. Hindley at first attempted to downplay her role, claiming Brady had manipulated her. However, the overwhelming evidence led to both being convicted and sentenced to life in prison. While they were tried for the deaths of 3 children, they were strongly suspected of being responsible for others. Despite their convictions, one victim, Keith Bennett, was never found, leaving his family in heartbreaking limbo. Brady, who passed away in 2017, refused to disclose the location of his remains, keeping the full truth hidden. His secrecy left a lasting pain for Keith's family, especially his mother, Winnie Johnson, who tirelessly sought closure until her own death. Stephen Port, often referred to as the Grinder Killer, was responsible for a series of tragic deaths between 2014 and 2015, targeting young gay men in London. His crimes were particularly shocking, not only because of their premeditated nature, but also due to the failure of law enforcement to recognize the connections between the victims. By using dating apps such as Grindr to find and exploit his victims, Port's actions left a lasting impact on the LGBTQ+ community and raised critical concerns about safety and bias in investigations. Born in 1975 in Southend-on-Sea, England, Port was raised in a middle-class household. Despite this seemingly ordinary background, by adulthood, Port had grown into an introverted and isolated figure. Working as a chef, he presented himself as a quiet individual to his neighbors. However, his online persona was markedly different. Using dating apps, Port would often misrepresent himself, appearing more charismatic and appealing to young men than he was in reality. Port's method involved luring vulnerable individuals, often younger gay men, into meetings. His primary tool for finding his victims was the dating app Grindr, which allowed him to present a facade of charm and friendliness. However, beneath this veneer, Port harbored deeply harmful intentions, exploiting the anonymity of online interactions to manipulate his targets. The first known victim of Stephen Port was 23-year-old Anthony Walgate, a fashion student. In June 2014, Port contacted Walgate through a false escort service and invited him to his home. Shortly after their meeting, Walgate tragically lost his life, and his body was found near Port's residence. Initially, law enforcement failed to recognize the circumstances surrounding Walgate's death, partly due to the misleading information Port provided. Just 2 months later, in August 2014, Port claimed another victim, 22-year-old Gabriel Kovari from Slovakia. Kovari's body was discovered in a graveyard not far from Port's home. In September 2014, 21-year-old Daniel Whitworth became the third victim found in the same location. To complicate matters further, Port left a staged side note on Whitworth's body, attempting to make it appear as if Whitworth had unintentionally caused Kovari's death and taken his life out of guilt. It wasn't until September 2015, when 25-year-old Jack Taylor was found deceased under eerily similar circumstances, that the police began to piece together the pattern. Taylor had also met Port through Grindr, and the similarities between his case and the previous deaths were hard to ignore. One of the most controversial aspects of the Stephen Port case was the police's failure to connect the dots sooner. Despite the similarities in the victims' profiles and the circumstances of their deaths, police initially treated them as unrelated incidents, even accepting the fabricated side note as genuine evidence. This oversight allowed Port to continue his actions, leading to more tragic losses. The LGBTQ+ community and the victims' families repeatedly pushed for deeper investigations, but their concerns were largely disregarded. Critics argue that the police response may have been influenced by bias, contributing to a lack of urgency in the investigation. It wasn't until Jack Taylor's death, coupled with intense media scrutiny and public pressure, that law enforcement took a closer look at the case. Stephen Port was arrested in October 2015 after investigators re-examined the evidence from the string of deaths. This included CCTV footage showing Port with some of his victims and other key details that revealed his involvement. Investigators found that Port had a pattern of carefully planning and covering up his actions, particularly by using drugs and disposing of evidence. During his trial, the prosecution presented overwhelming evidence, including Port's online activity and the materials found in his possession. Port showed little emotion throughout the proceedings and offered no substantial defense. In November 2016, he was convicted of the murders of Anthony Walgate, Gabriel Kovari, Daniel Whitworth, and Jack Taylor, as well as several other charges related to assaults on individuals who had survived his attacks. Port received a life sentence without the possibility of parole. Gary Ridgway, infamously known as the Green River Killer, is responsible for the deaths of at least 49 women, though he has claimed the number could be as high as 80. Ridgway's crimes, which terrorized the Pacific Northwest from the early 1980s to the early 2000s, targeted vulnerable women, particularly sex workers and runaways. His ability to evade capture for nearly 2 decades while leading an outwardly normal life made his case one of the most infamous in American criminal history. Born in 1949 in Salt Lake City, Utah, Gary Ridgway's early life was fraught with difficulties. His family dynamics were often troubled, with reports suggesting his mother was controlling, while his father expressed disdain for sex workers. This environment seemed to have a profound impact on Ridgway, as he developed complex and conflicted feelings about women, particularly those working in vulnerable professions. Ridgway exhibited concerning behaviors as a child, including bedwetting, which psychological studies sometimes associate with later violent tendencies, especially when accompanied by parental humiliation. His struggles continued into adolescence, where he was described as having low academic performance and difficulty connecting with peers. Despite these challenges, Ridgway managed to appear outwardly ordinary. After high school, he joined the Navy and served in Vietnam. It was during this time that he began soliciting sex workers, a practice he would continue throughout his life. Despite his troubled inner world, Ridgway married 3 times and fathered a son, managing to keep his dark desires hidden from those around him. Ridgway's killing spree began in 1982 in Washington state, specifically around the Seattle and Tacoma areas. Ridgway used promises of money or rides to lure his victims into his truck or home, where he would strangle them, either with his hands or with improvised ligatures, before dumping their bodies in remote areas, often near the Green River, hence his notorious moniker. The discovery of the first victims near the Green River set off alarm bells, but Ridgway's method of selecting victims from marginalized groups made it difficult for investigators to track the pattern. He developed a routine for disposing of his victims' remains, sometimes revisiting the sites to engage in disturbing behavior with the bodies. This level of calculated planning, paired with his ability to blend into everyday life, allowed him to escape suspicion for years. Despite leading a horrific double life, Ridgway held down a steady job as a truck painter for over 30 years and lived in a suburban home. His unremarkable appearance and stable existence made him seem like an unlikely suspect, which helped him evade capture for an extended period. He successfully maintained his facade while committing dozens of murders. The Green River Task Force was established in the mid-1980s to investigate the growing number of murders in the area. However, despite the mounting bodies and evidence, Ridgway remained at large. His ability to avoid detection was partly due to his ability to blend into the community. He was seen as an average man, far from the stereotypical image of a serial killer. At one point, FBI profiler John Douglas and notorious serial killer Ted Bundy became involved in the investigation. Bundy, then imprisoned, provided insight into Ridgway's likely behavior, predicting that the killer would return to the crime scenes. Though Bundy's profile was helpful in shaping the investigation, it was not enough to capture Ridgway at the time. The major breakthrough came nearly 20 years after the murders began, thanks to advances in DNA technology. In 1987, Ridgway had been compelled to provide a saliva sample, which was re-examined in 2001 using modern techniques. The DNA matched several victims, finally leading to Ridgway's arrest on November 30, 2001, ending his years of terror. Faced with the undeniable DNA evidence, Ridgway confessed to the murders of 48 women in a plea deal that allowed him to avoid the death penalty. His confessions were chillingly detailed, recounting how he would select, lure, and kill his victims. Ridgway's detached manner during these confessions was unsettling, particularly considering the number of lives he had taken. As part of the plea agreement, he also helped investigators locate the remains of several additional victims, bringing some closure to the victims' families. The plea deal, though controversial, was deemed necessary by prosecutors to ensure Ridgway's cooperation in recovering the bodies of his victims and to provide answers to the families. In exchange, Ridgway was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, ensuring that he would never be free again. The nihilistic serial killer. Carl Panzram was one of the most terrifying and nihilistic figures in criminal history, driven by an intense hatred for humanity. Born in 1891 to poor Prussian immigrants on a Minnesota farm, his early life was marked by violence and abuse. Sent to reform schools where he was frequently beaten and silly abused, Panzram developed a deep disdain for authority and a worldview rooted in cruelty. By the age of 12, he was already committing petty crimes, setting the stage for his violent adult life. As an adult, Panzram's criminal career escalated dramatically. After a dishonorable discharge from the U.S. Army for theft, he began roaming the country, committing burglaries, assaults, and arsons. He claimed to have committed thousands of crimes, including at least 21 murders, though the exact number remains unknown. His first confirmed murder occurred in 1920, when he lured and killed a man in New York, bludgeoning him to death with a rock. Panzram's violent tendencies knew no borders. He committed crimes across the U.S., South America, and Africa, making him difficult to track and prosecute. In one of his most audacious acts, Panzram stole a yacht, using it to lure and kill sailors, dumping their bodies overboard. His international crimes included the murder of a young boy in Angola. This ability to move freely between countries allowed him to evade justice for many years. What truly sets Panzram apart from other serial killers is his unapologetic embrace of evil. He expressed no remorse for his actions, instead writing an autobiography in prison where he openly detailed his hatred for humanity. Panzram believed that society deserved the cruelty he inflicted, viewing his violent acts as a form of revenge. He famously wrote, "I have no desire to reform myself. I believe the only way to reform people is to kill them." This nihilistic outlook, where violence was seen as a natural response to a cruel world, made him uniquely chilling. Even in prison, Panzram's violent nature persisted. In 1928, while incarcerated at Leavenworth Penitentiary, he killed a prison worker, Robert Warnke, by beating him to death with an iron bar. This murder sealed his fate, leading to his final death sentence. When the time came for his execution, Panzram remained defiant, telling the court he wished they all had one neck, so he could strangle them at once. His last words before being hanged in 1930 were a final act of rebellion. "Hurry it up, you Hoosier bastard. I could kill a dozen men while you're screwing around." Dennis Nilsen, often referred to as the Muswell Hill murderer or kindly killer, was a Scottish serial killer who murdered at least 12 young men between 1978 and 1983. His crimes were horrifying, not only because of the sheer number of victims, but due to the gruesome methods he used to dispose of the bodies. He was convicted in 1983, serving life in prison until his death in 2018. Nilsen's background played a significant role in shaping his disturbing behavior. Born in 1945, his childhood was relatively unremarkable, but early signs of his troubling psychology began emerging during his time in the British Army. Serving as a cook, Nilsen experienced deep loneliness and developed morbid fantasies involving dominance, control, and death. His fantasies began to take a more sinister turn during his deployment in Aden, where the trauma of violent experiences possibly triggered his fascination with death. He would later confess that he envisioned sexual encounters with the lifeless bodies of men, and this deeply disturbing fantasy evolved into his actual killing spree. Nilsen's modus operandi involved luring young men, often homeless or down on their luck, to his home. After killing them, typically through strangulation or drowning, he would bathe and dress their bodies, sometimes keeping them for extended periods. He lived with the bodies for days or weeks before remembering and disposing of them. Nilsson attempted to hide his crimes by flushing body parts down the toilet or burning them in his backyard, but he was ultimately discovered when his plumbing became clogged with human remains. Lassen's trial was notable for the chilling lack of remorse he displayed. He confessed to the murders in great detail, but refused to take responsibility for his actions, citing his loneliness and repressed sexuality as contributing factors. His case raises important questions about how societal rejection and emotional isolation can fuel monstrous behavior. Dean Corll, infamously known as the Candyman and the Pied Piper, was an American serial killer responsible for at least 28 murders of young boys and men in Houston, Texas, between 1970 and 1973. Despite the heinous nature of his crimes, Corll remains less well-known compared to other notorious serial killers. His violent spree ended in 1973 when one of his accomplices, 17-year-old Elmer Wayne Henley, shot and killed him. Born on December 24, 1939, in Fort Wayne, Indiana, Corll's early life was unstable due to his parents' troubled marriage and subsequent divorce. He lived with his mother, moving frequently, and was described as a shy and introverted child. He worked in his family's candy company, where he earned the nickname the Candyman for handing out candy to local children. After a brief stint in the Army, Corll returned to the family business, which operated near schools in Houston, allowing him to build relationships with young boys, many of whom would later become his victims. Corll's killing spree is believed to have begun in 1970, with David Owen Brooks and Elmer Wayne Henley acting as his accomplices. Corll lured his victims, boys aged 13 to 20, under the guise of offering rides, parties, or money. Once in his home, the victims were handcuffed, tortured on a plywood torture board, and eventually killed by strangulation or shooting. Corll buried the bodies in various locations, including a rented boat shed, a forest near Lake Sam Rayburn, and a beach on the Bolivar Peninsula. The killings, later dubbed the Houston Mass Murders, claimed at least 28 lives. Most of the victims were from the low-income Houston Heights neighborhood, and their disappearances were initially dismissed by police, which allowed Corll's crimes to continue unnoticed for years. The true extent of the murders only came to light after Henley shot Corll on August 8, 1973, during an argument. Henley had brought two friends, Timothy Curley and Rhonda Williams, to Corll's house, where Corll became enraged. After Corll handcuffed the trio with the intent to kill them, Henley convinced him to release him, and then shot Corll in self-defense. Henley confessed to the murders and led authorities to the burial sites, where the remains of 17 victims were uncovered. He and Brooks were both convicted of multiple murders, with Henley receiving multiple life sentences and Brooks sentenced to life for his role. Despite the gruesome nature of his crimes, Corll's name is often overshadowed by other serial killers of the era, but his story remains one of the darkest in American crime history. Richard Trenton Chase, known as the Vampire of Sacramento, was an American serial killer and cannibal responsible for the brutal murders of 6 people in Sacramento, California, over a 1-month period in 1977. His gruesome crimes involved necrophilia and cannibalism, with a fixation on consuming his victims' blood, stemming from his severe mental illness. Chase was born on May 23, 1950, into a troubled home where emotional trauma and family conflict marked his early years. He exhibited disturbing behaviors from a young age, such as cruelty to animals and setting fires, traits often linked to violent criminals. As he grew older, his mental health deteriorated further, developing delusions that his organs were failing and that drinking blood was the only way to prevent his body from disintegrating. This belief led to his fixation on consuming animal blood, which later escalated to seeking human blood. In 1975, Chase was institutionalized after he was found covered in blood, having consumed the blood of a rabbit. Diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, he was released into his mother's care, who stopped his medication, leading to a severe decline in his mental state. By 1977, Chase was living alone, deeply isolated, increasingly disconnected from reality. Chase's killing spree began on December 29, 1977, when he shot and killed 51-year-old Ambrose Griffin in a random attack. His crimes escalated on January 23, 1978, when he broke into the home of 22-year-old Teresa Wallen, who was pregnant. Chase brutally murdered her, engaged in philia, and drank her blood. Just days later, on January 27th, Chase committed his most horrific crime, murdering Evelyn Miroth, her 6-year-old son Jason, her nephew David, and her friend Dan Meredith. He mutilated the bodies, cannibalized them, and removed some of David's organs before fleeing the scene in Meredith's car. The level of violence in these murders shocked investigators and the public. Chase's apartment was found in a grotesque state, with blood-stained walls, human organs in his fridge, and blood-soaked utensils, revealing the depth of his delusions and cannibalistic rituals. Following the murders, police linked Chase to the crimes through ballistic evidence, and he was arrested on January 28, 1978. During his trial, Chase's defense argued insanity, but the jury convicted him of 6 counts of murder, sentencing him to death in 1979. While on death row, Chase was a target of abuse from other inmates due to his reputation as a cannibal. On December 26, 1980, Chase died by overdosing on medication in his cell. The Axeman of New Orleans was an unidentified serial killer who terrorized New Orleans and nearby areas between May 1918 and October 1919. Responsible for at least 6 murders and multiple injuries, the killer primarily targeted Italian grocers, breaking into their homes at night and attacking them with an axe, often using the victim's own tools. His random and brutal attacks, along with a letter he sent to the press claiming to be a demon from the hottest hell, turned him into a figure of both horror and mystery. The first recorded attack occurred on May 23, 1918, when Joseph Maggio and his wife, Catherine, were brutally murdered in their home. Over the following months, other attacks followed a similar pattern. An intruder would chisel open a door or window, enter homes while the occupants slept, and strike them with an axe. Survivors reported waking up to a shadowy figure looming over them. The axeman often left little evidence, confounding investigators. Notable victims include Joseph and Catherine Maggio, grocer Louis Bessumer and his mistress Harriet Lowe, and pregnant Anna Schneider, who survived her attack. The killer's final known victim, Mike Pepitone, was murdered on October 27, 1919, but no one ever identified the axeman. One of the most infamous aspects of the case was a letter the axeman sent to a local newspaper on March 13, 1919, where he claimed to be a supernatural being and warned that he would strike again on March 19th. He cryptically wrote that anyone playing jazz music that night would be spared, prompting a citywide jazz night where homes and clubs played jazz to avoid the killer's wrath. No murders occurred that night, further fueling the legend of the axeman. Despite extensive investigations, the axeman's identity remains unknown, and the case stands as one of America's most notorious unsolved serial killings. Clifford Robert Olson Jr. was a notorious Canadian serial killer responsible for the murders of at least 11 children and teenagers in British Columbia between 1980 and 1981. His calculated and brutal crimes shocked the nation, and his manipulative behavior, both before and after his arrest, made him one of the most reviled figures in Canadian history. Born on January 1, 1940, Olson had a troubled upbringing and a long criminal history. By the time of his arrest for murder, he had accumulated over 90 convictions for various offenses, including theft, assault, and armed robbery. Despite his extensive criminal record, his capacity for violence went unnoticed until his horrific killing spree. Between November 1980 and July 1981, Olson abducted, sexually assaulted, and murdered 11 victims, most of whom were between the ages of 9 and 18. He lured his victims, often hitchhiking or walking alone, into his car with promises of rides or money before violently attacking them. His victims included Christine Weller, 12, Darren Johnsrud, 16, Simon Partington, 9, and Judy Cosma, 14, all of whom suffered brutal fates at Olson's hands. Olson was arrested in August 1981 after attempting to abduct 2 girls. Once in custody, he made a controversial deal with the Canadian government. In exchange for $100,000 to be paid to his wife and son, he would reveal the locations of his victims' bodies. Known as the cash for bodies deal, this arrangement outraged the public, though authorities believed it was necessary to bring closure to the victims' families. In January 1982, Olson pled guilty to 11 counts of first-degree murder and was sentenced to 11 consecutive life sentences with no possibility of parole for 25 years. Despite being imprisoned, he continued to manipulate the system, writing letters to victims' families and repeatedly petitioning for parole, even though his chances of release were non-existent. His actions furthered his notoriety and reignited debates about parole eligibility for serial killers in Canada. Olson died of cancer on September 30, 2011, at the age of 71, bringing an end to one of the darkest chapters in Canadian criminal history. Gilbert Paul Jordan, also known as the Boozing Barber, was a Canadian serial killer responsible for the deaths of at least 10 women, many of whom were Indigenous. His method of killing was unusual. He used alcohol as his weapon, force-feeding his victims dangerous amounts until they died of alcohol poisoning. Operating in Vancouver, British Columbia, from the late 1960s through the 1980s, he primarily targeted marginalized women from Vancouver's downtown east side, a neighborhood plagued by poverty and crime. Despite being connected to numerous deaths, Jordan was only convicted of manslaughter in one case due to the difficulty of proving his method as murder under Canadian law. Born on December 12, 1931, in Vancouver, Jordan had a criminal record dating back to the 1950s, including theft, assault, and drunk driving. A trained barber, he earned the nickname the Boozing Barber due to his heavy drinking habits. He frequented bars in downtown East Side, where he befriended vulnerable women, often offering them alcohol in exchange for company or sex. Once alone, Jordan encouraged them to drink excessively, sometimes force-feeding them alcohol until they succumbed to poisoning. Jordan's victims were often Indigenous women who struggled with addiction or were involved in work. His focus on marginalized women, combined with the lack of urgency from law enforcement, allowed him to evade serious consequences for years. Many of his victims' deaths were initially ruled as alcohol-related accidents. Jordan's pattern of behavior came to light after Vanessa Buckner's death. Witnesses testified that Jordan had forced her to continue drinking even after she became unconscious. Jordan was convicted of manslaughter in Buckner's death in 1988 and sentenced to 15 years in prison. However, he served only 6 years before being released on parole in 1994. Following his release, Jordan continued to breach parole conditions by frequenting bars and exhibiting suspicious behavior. Despite these violations, he was never convicted of another murder. His continued dangerous activities sparked public outrage and calls for criminal justice reform, particularly concerning how parole is handled for violent offenders in Canada. Jordan died on July 7, 2006, in a long-term care facility in Vancouver. His case left a dark legacy, exposing systemic issues in Canada's justice system and highlighting the vulnerabilities faced by marginalized women, particularly Indigenous women. His ability to evade serious legal consequences for years despite his deadly actions remains a stark reminder of the flaws in handling serial offenders. Robert William Pickton, also known as Willie Pickton, is one of Canada's most notorious serial killers. Convicted of murdering 6 women, though suspected of killing as many as 49, Pickton operated from his family's pig farm in Port Coquitlam, British Columbia, where he lured vulnerable women, often from Vancouver's downtown east side, to their deaths. His heinous crimes, which involved disposing of bodies by feeding them to pigs, shocked the nation and exposed severe failings in law enforcement's handling of missing persons cases, particularly marginalized women involved in work and struggling with addiction. Born on October 24, 1949, in Port Coquitlam, Pickton grew up on the family's pig farm, which was known for its squalor. His parents were neglectful, leaving Pickton and his siblings to fend for themselves. He dropped out of school in the 9th grade and worked on the farm, which would later become the center of his horrific crimes. As an adult, Pickton was a loner, often described as disheveled and socially awkward. Despite this, he found some success as a pig farmer and through his nonprofit charity, which hosted wild parties that often involved workers from Vancouver's downtown east side. This neighborhood, plagued by poverty and addiction, was where many of Pickton's victims lived. The area's high crime rate and the marginalized status of the women Picton targeted meant their disappearances were often overlooked or inadequately investigated by authorities. Picton's killing spree likely began in the late 1980s, but it wasn't until the 1990s and early 2000s that he came under serious suspicion. He targeted vulnerable women, luring them to his farm with promises of money or drugs. Once there, Picton murdered them, typically through strangulation or sting, and disposed of their bodies in unimaginably gruesome ways. One of his primary methods involved feeding the remains to his pigs, making it nearly impossible for investigators to recover remains. Many of his victims' disappearances went unnoticed or unreported, allowing him to kill for nearly 2 decades undetected. The isolated location of his farm, combined with the vulnerable status of his victims, helped Picton evade law enforcement for years. Despite complaints from family members of missing women, police investigations into the disappearances from Vancouver's downtown east side were slow and underfunded. Systemic bias against workers and Indigenous women further delayed serious inquiries. In 1997, Picton was arrested for the attempted murder of a woman who escaped after he stabbed her, but the charges were dropped, a major misstep that allowed him to continue killing. It wasn't until 2002, when a search warrant was executed on Picton's farm for firearms violations, that police uncovered evidence of his horrific crimes. Investigators found human remains, including bone fragments and personal items belonging to missing women, leading to the farm being declared one of the largest crime scenes in Canadian history. Picton was charged with the murders of 26 women, though he is suspected of killing many more. His trial, one of the longest and most complex in Canadian history, began in 2007. Due to the sheer volume of evidence, the trial was divided into 2 parts, with Picton initially tried for the murders of 6 women. Graphic testimony and forensic evidence revealed the full extent of his crimes, including how he disposed of bodies by feeding them to pigs. In December 2007, Picton was convicted of second-degree murder for the 6 deaths, receiving a life sentence with no chance of parole for 25 years, the maximum penalty in Canada. The remaining 20 charges were stayed, a controversial decision that angered many of the victims' families, who felt they had been denied justice. The failure to act on early warning signs, such as the 1997 attempted murder charge, has been heavily criticized. In response, the British Columbia government launched the Missing Women Commission of Inquiry in 2010, which found systemic bias against sex workers and Indigenous women contributed to the delay in investigating the disappearances. The commission made several recommendations to improve police procedures and address the vulnerabilities of marginalized communities. After his conviction, Picton reportedly confessed to an undercover officer that he had killed 49 women and had intended to kill 50. This admission, captured on video, has led many to believe that Picton's true victim count may be even higher than initially thought. Despite his confession, the full extent of Picton's crimes may never be known due to the methods he used to dispose of the bodies. Herbert Mullen was a serial killer active in California during the early 1970s, responsible for the brutal murders of 13 people. Born in 1947, Mullen grew up in a middle-class family, excelling as a popular student athlete during his youth. However, as he entered adulthood, Mullen began to exhibit signs of mental illness, which rapidly worsened in the years leading up to his killings. He suffered from paranoid delusions and auditory hallucinations, which became the driving force behind his murderous spree. Mullen believed that catastrophic earthquakes in California could only be averted through human sacrifice. In his psychotic state, he was convinced that the voices in his head were instructing him to kill in order to save the state from destruction. This delusion became the central motive for his seemingly random and erratic murders. Herbert Mullen's killings began in 1972, when he murdered a homeless man by brutally beating and stabbing him. Over the following months, his violence escalated, resulting in the deaths of 12 more victims in Santa Cruz County. Unlike other serial killers who target specific types of victims, Mullen's murders were indiscriminate, involving people from various walks of life. His victims included random pedestrians, teenagers camping in a park, acquaintances, and even a priest. Mullen's mental instability and delusional beliefs made his crimes particularly unpredictable. Mullen's erratic nature and spontaneous approach to murder set him apart from other serial killers of the era, like Edmund Kemper, who was also active in the same region. While Kemper's crimes were more organized and rooted in a desire for control, Mullen's actions were chaotic, driven by his belief that he was preventing natural disasters through these human sacrifices. As his mental state deteriorated, Mullen's paranoia and hallucinations became more severe, eventually leading to his downfall. Mullen's erratic behavior and lack of a clear pattern to his killings led to his capture in 1973. After his arrest, he was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, a condition that had clearly shaped his motives and actions. During his trial, the primary focus was on Mullen's sanity. His defense team argued that his actions were the direct result of his mental illness and that he was not fully aware of what he was doing. However, the prosecution argued that Mullen knew right from wrong and could still be held accountable for his crimes. The jury ultimately found Mullen legally sane during the killings, and he was convicted of 10 of the 13 murders. He was sentenced to life in prison, where he remains to this day. Despite the clear influence of his mental illness, the legal system determined that Mullen's awareness of his actions, however delusional, made him culpable for the crimes. Leonard Lake was a notorious American serial killer who, alongside his accomplice Charles Ng, was responsible for a series of gruesome murders during the 1980s. Born in San Francisco in 1945, Lake had a troubled childhood marked by early signs of disturbing behavior, including terrorism and the torture of small animals. His military service in Vietnam only deepened his psychological issues, leaving him further disconnected from societal norms. After leaving the Marines, Lake developed a fascination with survivalism, doomsday scenarios, and the idea of a personal M project, a vision of creating a bunker where he would keep women as sex slaves. He began hoarding supplies, firearms, and building his ideal survivalist compound in rural California. In 1983, Lake met Charles Ng, a younger man with a similarly dark mindset, who became his accomplice in a horrific spree of abductions, torture, and murder. Together, they built a bunker at Lake's cabin in Wilseyville, California, equipped with rooms for imprisoning their victims. Their sadistic methods included rape, torture, and eventual murder, with many of the atrocities recorded on videotapes, where they referred to their victims as part of Lake's Operation Miranda, a twisted plan based on his fantasies. Over the course of their killing spree, Lake and Ng are believed to have murdered at least 11 people, though the true number could be higher. Their victims included entire families, as well as women they abducted to be subjected to their deranged fantasies. The exact number of victims remains unknown, as evidence suggests that they likely killed many more people whose remains were never found. The duo's reign of terror came to an end in 1985 when Lake was arrested for shoplifting. While in custody, police discovered evidence linking him to the missing persons cases. Before the investigation could proceed, Lake ingested cyanide pills he had hidden in his clothing himself to avoid facing justice. Ng, on the other hand, fled to Canada, leading to a lengthy extradition battle before he was finally tried and convicted in the United States in 1999. In the early 1980s, Atlanta, Georgia was gripped by fear as young black children and adolescents began to disappear. Between 1979 and 1981, 29 black youths, most of them children, were murdered. Authorities, local communities, and the FBI were engaged in an intense manhunt to capture whoever was responsible for these heinous crimes. The turning point in the investigation came in 1981 when Wayne Williams, a 23-year-old freelance photographer, music producer, and self-proclaimed talent scout, was arrested and eventually convicted for 2 of the murders. Williams grew up in Atlanta, the only child of 2 school teachers, and by all accounts was ambitious and intelligent. Despite having a strong interest in media and entertainment, Williams was far from a major player in those industries. The investigation took a significant leap when police, staking out bridges over the Chattahoochee River, heard a splash, followed shortly by Williams driving over the bridge. When the authorities stopped him, he offered a weak explanation for his whereabouts. A few days later, the body of Nathaniel Cater, one of the victims, was found downstream. This connection drew the suspicion of the police and eventually led to Williams becoming the prime suspect. Forensic evidence played a crucial role in linking Williams to the crimes. Carpet fibers from Williams's home, his car, and even his dog were found on some of the victims. Though he was never tried for all the murders, Williams was convicted for the murders of Nathaniel Cater and Jimmy Ray Payne, both of whom were adults rather than children. The prosecution argued that fibers from Williams' environment, as well as his presence at the Chattahoochee River the night Cater's body was dumped, were compelling proof of his involvement. However, controversy and debate still surround Williams' conviction. While he was imprisoned for the two murders, many believe Williams was responsible for the entire Atlanta murders case, even though no charges were brought for the other 27 victims. Some believe the case was closed prematurely, as authorities wanted to quell public fear and pressure. There are those who continue to question whether Williams was truly the serial killer behind all of the deaths, or if there was more to the story. Williams has always maintained his innocence. In the 1990s, he even attempted to get his case reopened. Some have argued that the investigation was racially biased or that the authorities were looking for a scapegoat to put the city at ease. In 2019, Atlanta Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms announced that new evidence in the case would be re-examined, focusing on modern DNA testing methods that were not available during the original investigation. This decision reignited interest in the case and the question of whether the real killer had been caught. Paul Bernardo, later known as one of Canada's most notorious criminals, led a seemingly normal life that hid a much darker side. Born in 1964 in Scarborough, Ontario, Bernardo grew up in a household that was troubled, with his father involved in criminal behavior. Despite these challenges, Bernardo outwardly appeared to live a successful and ordinary life. He was charming, good-looking, and educated, traits that allowed him to blend easily into society. However, behind this facade, he harbored disturbing tendencies that would eventually lead to a series of serious crimes. Between 1987 and 1990, a string of attacks occurred in the Scarborough area. Young women were targeted by an assailant who committed a series of unlawful acts against them. Despite numerous police investigations and attempts to catch the perpetrator, Bernardo managed to evade capture, growing more confident in his ability to escape justice. It wasn't until years later that his DNA would link him to these offenses, but by then, his crimes had escalated significantly. In 1987, Bernardo met Karla Homolka, a young woman who would later become his wife. On the surface, they appeared to be a perfect couple, often compared to the iconic Ken and Barbie dolls due to their attractive appearances. However, beneath this image, their relationship was far from healthy. Together, they began to engage in increasingly unlawful and harmful behavior. Karla, who had previously seemed like an ordinary person, played an active role in assisting Bernardo with his criminal activities. Their first known victim was Karla's younger sister, Tammy. In a tragic incident in 1990, Bernardo and Homolka gave Tammy harmful substances, which resulted in her passing. Though the incident was initially ruled an accident, it was later revealed that Bernardo and Homolka were responsible. Despite this, the couple continued their criminal partnership, and their actions became even more serious. In 1991, they abducted Leslie Mahaffey, a 14-year-old girl, whom they held in their home for several days. During this time, they subjected her to cruel and inhumane treatment. Tragically, Leslie did not survive. Her body was later found, encased in concrete, and left in a nearby lake, which led to a police investigation. Despite this, Bernardo and Homolka remained free. Their next victim was Kristen French, a 15-year-old girl whom they kidnapped in 1992. Kristen endured a similar fate, and her body was found weeks later, abandoned in a ditch. Her death sparked outrage, and the pressure on law enforcement to solve the case intensified. Bernardo's reign of terror came to an end in 1993 when his relationship with Karla deteriorated. Fearing for her own safety, Karla went to the authorities and made a deal, providing testimony against Bernardo in exchange for a reduced sentence. She claimed to be a victim of Bernardo's control, though later evidence suggested she was an active participant. Samuel Little. Samuel Little, born on June 7, 1940, in Reynolds, Georgia, is often considered the most prolific serial killer in U.S. history. His early years were marked by instability and brushes with the law. Dropping out of high school, he led a transient lifestyle and committed minor crimes, but his violent tendencies soon escalated, particularly against women. Little's victims were primarily marginalized women, sex workers, drug users, and individuals on society's fringes. His transient lifestyle enabled him to target women across the U.S., including states like California, Ohio, and Florida. Little would use his charm to lure victims, then strangle them, a method that left little evidence behind. The majority of his victims were black women, whose disappearances were often neglected by authorities, making it easier for him to evade capture. Little's first known murder occurred in 1970, but he later confessed to killings dating back to the late 1960s. Despite numerous arrests for lesser crimes, Little remained under the radar. In 2012, Little was arrested in Kentucky on unrelated charges and extradited to California, where DNA evidence linked him to 3 murders in Los Angeles from the 1980s. This finally led to his conviction and life sentence in 2014. While serving time, he made a shocking confession in 2018. He had killed 93 women in total. Skeptical at first, investigators verified many of his claims, confirming his involvement in 60 cases. Little's memory was uncanny. He provided vivid details and even sketches of his victims, helping solve decades-old cold cases. Little's story revealed deep flaws in the justice system, as his victims' cases were often dismissed due to their backgrounds. His confessions forced a re-evaluation of how authorities handle cases involving vulnerable individuals, highlighting how societal neglect can enable predators like him. Samuel Little's death in 2020 closed one of the darkest chapters in American criminal history. Belle Gunness, born on November 11, 1859, in Selbu, Norway, became one of America's most infamous female serial killers. After immigrating to the U.S. in 1881, she settled in Chicago and married Mads Sorensen in 1884. Their candy store mysteriously burned down, and shortly after, Mads died under suspicious circumstances, allowing Belle to collect insurance payouts, a pattern that defined her life. After Mads' death, Belle moved to La Porte, Indiana, where she bought a farmhouse and lured men through newspaper ads. Posing as a wealthy widow seeking marriage, she attracted suitors who brought their life savings, only to vanish upon reaching her farm. Belle's method involved poisoning or blunt force trauma, followed by dismemberment. Bodies were either buried on her property or disposed of in hog pens. Authorities estimate she may have killed over 40 men, though the true number is unknown. Her motivation was purely financial, driven by greed for insurance money and stolen wealth. Belle's lethal tendencies extended to her own family. 2 of her children died mysteriously, and her second husband, Peter Gunness, died after a suspicious accident. Even her foster daughter, Jenny Olson, disappeared in 1906. Jenny's body was later found on the farm. Belle's growing fortune came from insurance payouts and the assets of her victims. In April 1908, Belle's farmhouse burned to the ground. Investigators found the bodies of her 3 children and a headless woman believed to be Belle, though doubts lingered. Ray Lamphere, a former farmhand obsessed with Belle, was arrested and confessed that Belle planned the fire to fake her own death. He claimed she had decapitated a woman to use as a body double and escaped. The discovery of numerous dismembered bodies on her property revealed the extent of her crimes, but Belle's fate remains a mystery. Arthur Shawcross, born on June 6, 1945, in Kittery, Maine, earned the notorious title of the Genesee River Killer for his brutal murder spree in the late 1980s. Despite a seemingly ordinary early life, Shawcross's childhood was marked by emotional instability, violent tendencies, and claims of severe abuse, which he later said contributed to his horrific actions. In 1972, Shawcross committed his first known murders, assaulting and killing 2 young children, Jack Owen Blake and Karen Ann Hill. Convicted of these heinous acts, he served only 14 years of a 25-year sentence before being released in 1987. This decision proved disastrous, as Shawcross would soon resume his deadly pursuits. His early release highlighted significant flaws in the criminal justice system, allowing a dangerous predator back into society. After moving to Rochester, New York, Shawcross began targeting sex workers. Between 1988 and 1990, he murdered at least 11 women, brutally attacking and mutilating them before dumping their bodies near the Genesee River. His crimes were marked by a disturbing escalation in violence, with necrophilia and cannibalism becoming part of his depraved behavior. Shawcross's ability to evade capture for so long was due in part to his careful selection of marginalized victims, who often received less attention from law enforcement. Authorities finally caught a break in January 1990 when they spotted Shawcross acting suspiciously near a bridge where one of his victims was later found. He was arrested and, during interrogation, coldly confessed to the murders, describing his actions with chilling indifference. His trial, marked by gruesome revelations and a failed insanity defense, resulted in a sentence of 250 years in prison. Rodney Alcala, known as the dating game killer, terrorized California during the late 1970s, his charm and intelligence masking a deeply sadistic nature. He earned a degree from UCLA and studied under director Roman Polanski at NYU, an impressive background for a man who would become a notorious predator. In 1968, Alcala committed his first known attack, brutaling 8-year-old Tali Shapiro. Though she survived, he evaded capture, fleeing to New York and taking on a new identity. He was briefly imprisoned in 1971, but his release set the stage for a far more horrifying spree. Between 1977 and 1979, Alcala murdered at least 5 women, though investigators believe his true victim count could be much higher. A surreal moment in Alcala's life came in 1978 when he appeared on the TV show The Dating Game. Despite his ongoing killing spree, he presented himself as a charismatic and confident contestant, even winning the episode. His chilling duality, masking a monstrous side behind an appealing exterior, remains one of the case's most disturbing elements. Alcala's capture came in 1979 when he was linked to the abduction and murder of 12-year-old Robin Samso. A search of his belongings revealed a cache of photographs of girls, some of whom remain unidentified. Convicted and sentenced to death in 1980, Alcala's case went through decades of legal battles, with his convictions overturned twice before a final trial in 2010 secured his fate. Gary Heidnik is infamous for creating a real-life nightmare in his North Philadelphia home, where he kidnapped, tortured, and held women captive in his basement. Despite an IQ of a 148, he struggled with severe mental health issues, including schizoid personality disorder, and was discharged from the army due to these problems. His life spiraled into odd behavior, culminating in the creation of his twisted, United Church of the Ministers of God, which amassed a small following and substantial money, serving as a facade for his darker desires. Heidnik's criminal descent began in 1976 when he was arrested for kidnapping and assaulting a mentally disabled woman. After serving a short prison term, he began abducting women in 1986, keeping them in a gruesome house of horrors. His first victim, Josefina Rivera, was abducted in November 1986 and was soon joined by Sandra Lindsay, Lisa Thomas, Deborah Dudley, Jacqueline Askins, and Agnes Adams. Heidnik's control over his captives was brutal, keeping them chained in a pit, subjecting them to starvation, beatings, and abuse. He manipulated them, forcing acts of torture and fostering an atmosphere of constant fear. The horrors escalated when one victim, Sandra Lindsay, died from starvation and torture. Heidnik dismembered her body, cooking parts of her flesh and feeding it to the others. His heinous cannibalism showcased his complete disregard for humanity. He even pitted the women against each other, using fear of punishment to break their spirits. His behavior was not just physically abusive, but deeply psychologically torturous, reducing his captives to living in constant terror. It was Josefina Rivera who ultimately ended the nightmare. After months of earning his trust, she convinced Heidnik to let her leave temporarily, promising to return. Once free, Rivera alerted the police, leading to a raid on Heidnik's home in March 1987. The rescue of the remaining women revealed the full extent of the horror: a basement pit, chains, and grim evidence of torture and cannibalism. During his trial, Heidnick's defense argued insanity due to his long history of mental illness, but the prosecution proved he had meticulously planned his crimes. In 1988, Heidnick was convicted of 2 counts of murder and numerous other charges. He was sentenced to death and remained on death row until his execution by lethal injection in 1999. Joseph James DeAngelo, known as the Golden State Killer, is one of America's most notorious serial predators, responsible for at least 13 murders, over 50 and 120 burglaries from 1974 to 1986. Born on November 8, 1945 in New York, DeAngelo served in the U.S. Navy and then as a police officer in California, a position that helped him evade capture for decades. His crimes began in Visalia, California, where he was dubbed the Visalia Ransacker for a series of burglaries characterized by his obsession with women's belongings. By 1976, he escalated to violent assaults and became known as the East Area Racist, terrorizing Sacramento with a string of brutal home invasions and assaults. DeAngelo's attacks were methodically planned. He stalked his victims, learned their routines, and broke into their homes in the dead of night. Often, he would tie up male partners and balance dishes on their backs, threatening to kill the women if the dishes moved. His psychological torture included whispering threats and lingering in homes for hours, making his victims feel utterly powerless. By 1979, DeAngelo evolved into the original Night Stalker, committing a series of murders in Southern California. His assaults on couples escalated to murder as he restrained, tormented, and then killed his victims. The killings continued until 1986, when his last known victims, Janelle Cruz and Keith Harrington, were found dead. After this, DeAngelo mysteriously vanished, leaving a trail of terror but no clear suspect. Despite his horrific crimes, DeAngelo lived quietly among unsuspecting neighbors for decades, hiding behind the mask of a normal life. The case went cold for decades, until DNA technology linked the East Area to the original Night Stalker, proving them to be the same person, the Golden State Killer. However, it wasn't until 2018 that a groundbreaking technique called genetic genealogy finally identified DeAngelo. Investigators used a public genealogy website to trace DNA from the crime scenes to DeAngelo's family tree. On April 24, 2018, he was arrested at his home in Citrus Heights, California, after evading capture for over 40 years. In 2020, at age 74, DeAngelo pleaded guilty to 13 counts of first-degree murder and numerous other crimes in exchange for avoiding the death penalty. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole. The Cleveland Torso Murderer, also known as the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run, terrorized Cleveland, Ohio in the mid-1930s with a series of gruesome and macabre killings. Between 1935 and 1938, at least 12 dismembered and decapitated victims were discovered in the impoverished Kingsbury Run area. However, due to the nature of the crimes and the transient population in the area, the true number of victims remains unknown. The murderer was never caught, and the case remains one of America's most chilling, unsolved mysteries. The killings began in September 1935, when the lower half of a woman's torso was found on the shores of Lake Erie. Days later, a second male victim was discovered, similarly dismembered and decapitated. These initial murders set the tone for what would become the Cleveland Torso Murderer's horrific signature: mutilation, decapitation, and the disposal of body parts across the city's shanty towns and industrial areas. The neighborhood of Kingsbury Run, a bleak and desolate area filled with makeshift shantytowns, became the epicenter of the killings. Most of the victims were people living on society's margins: homeless individuals, sex workers, and transients. The killer preyed on the vulnerable, making identification difficult and the crimes harder to trace. Some bodies were never fully recovered, with limbs or heads missing, and others showed signs of chemical treatment, which made forensic analysis nearly impossible. Elliot Ness, the legendary law enforcement officer famed for taking down Al Capone, became involved in the case in 1936, when he was appointed Cleveland's safety director. Under intense public pressure to catch the killer, Ness employed a range of strategies, but the Mad Butcher remained elusive. In a desperate move, Ness ordered the shantytown in Kingsbury Run to be burned down in 1938, hoping to disrupt the killer's activities or uncover clues. However, this aggressive action yielded no results and only served to displace hundreds of impoverished residents. After the shantytown raid, the murders abruptly stopped, leading to speculation that the killer may have left the city, been incarcerated for unrelated crimes, or died. One prominent suspect was Dr. Francis E. Sweeney, a World War I veteran with medical knowledge and a history of mental instability. Although Elliot Ness personally interrogated Sweeney, no concrete evidence linked him to the crimes. Some believe Sweeney's influential connections may have protected him from further investigation. Another theory suggested that the torso murderer was a transient himself, perhaps moving from city to city, leaving a trail of similar unsolved murders across the Midwest. Despite extensive efforts by Ness and subsequent investigators, the identity of the Mad Butcher and his motives have never been uncovered. Eric Edgar Cooke, infamously known as the Nightcaller or the Nedlands Monster, was one of Australia's most unpredictable and terrifying serial killers. Between 1959 and 1963, Cooke launched a reign of terror across Perth, Western Australia, committing a series of random and brutal crimes that left at least 8 people dead and 22 others injured. His killings ranged from shootings and stabbings to hit-and-runs and home invasions. What made Cooke particularly dangerous was his lack of a consistent pattern. Unlike most serial killers who follow a set modus operandi, Cooke chose his victims and methods indiscriminately. One night, he would shoot a stranger in the street, and the next, he would break into a home and stab the residents to death. This unpredictability left investigators baffled, and for years the police struggled to connect the seemingly unrelated murders. Born in 1931 in Perth, Cooke had a troubled childhood marked by abuse and neglect. His father was an alcoholic who beat him, and Cooke himself was born with a cleft palate and speech impediment, which made him the target of bullying and social isolation. As a teenager, he developed a reputation for petty crimes, including arson and theft. Despite repeated arrests, his behavior escalated into violence. Cooke's first known murder occurred in 1959 when he bludgeoned an elderly man, Roland Smith, with an iron bar during a burglary. From that point on, his crimes became increasingly ruthless. He had no preference for age, gender, or location. For example, in 1960, Cooke broke into the home of 22-year-old Jillian Brewer and stabbed her to death with scissors, a crime so brutal and random that it shocked the community. As the Nightcaller, Cooke stalked the streets of Perth after dark, committing crimes seemingly without motive. Armed with a rifle, he would drive through the city, shooting pedestrians at random. One of his most senseless acts was the shooting of Rosemary Anderson, who was killed while walking along the road with her boyfriend. Cooke's indiscriminate violence, combined with his shifting methods, made it nearly impossible for police to determine that one man was responsible. The reign of terror finally ended in 1963 when Cooke was arrested after being spotted discarding a stolen rifle. During interrogation, he initially denied the murders, but later confessed to over 20 violent offenses, revealing chilling details about his crimes. Cooke's confessions led to the exoneration of 2 men, John Button and Darrell Beamish, who had been wrongly convicted of murders Cooke had committed. Their cases highlighted the dangers of wrongful convictions, made even more poignant by the fact that a killer like Cooke had been able to operate undetected for so long. In 1964, Cooke was executed by hanging, marking the end of one of Australia's most chaotic and terrifying serial killer cases. Richard Kuklinski, infamously known as the Iceman, was one of America's most notorious contract killers, operating for decades as a hitman for organized crime. Known for his ability to maintain a double life, one as a loving husband and father, and the other as a remorseless killer, Kuklinski claimed to have killed over 100 people, though the exact number remains uncertain. His chilling nickname, the Iceman, came from his practice of freezing his victims' bodies to obscure the time of death. Kuklinski was born on April 11, 1935, in Jersey City, New Jersey, into a family marred by violence and abuse. His father was a brutal alcoholic, and his mother was equally cruel. From a young age, Kuklinski experienced severe physical abuse, which shaped his future detachment from empathy. By his teenage years, Kuklinski had already committed his first murder, beating a man to death and discovering that he felt no remorse. During the 1950s, Kuklinski caught the attention of crime families in New York and New Jersey due to his fearlessness and violent nature. He was recruited as a hitman working for notorious crime organizations like the Gambino family. His preferred methods of killing were diverse. He used guns, knives, poison, and even his bare hands. One of his favored techniques involved using cyanide, a substance that could kill quickly and discreetly, often slipped into his victims' food or drink. What made Kuklinski particularly terrifying was his ability to separate his violent work from his family life. In 1961, he married Barbara Pedrisi, with whom he had 3 children. To his family and neighbors, Kuklinski appeared to be a loving, hard-working man who provided a comfortable life for his wife and kids. Behind this facade, however, he was a professional killer, leaving home to commit murders and returning as if he had been at a regular job. Kuklinski's most infamous method involved freezing his victims' bodies to throw off forensic experts. One case in 1983 illustrated this gruesome tactic. Louis Masguet's partially decomposed body was discovered 2 years after he went missing. An autopsy revealed that Masguet had been frozen, leading police to realize that his time of death had been deliberately altered. It was cases like this that earned Kuklinski his chilling nickname, the Iceman. After a long investigation known as Operation Iceman, Kuklinski was finally captured in 1986. Undercover federal agent Dominic Polifrone infiltrated his circle, posing as a hitman and recording Kuklinski's confessions. On December 17, 1986, Kuklinski was arrested outside his home and subsequently convicted of 5 murders, though he admitted to many more. In 1988, he was sentenced to life in prison without parole. While incarcerated, Kuklinski gave several interviews detailing his crimes, providing a glimpse into the mind of a methodical and detached killer. He died in prison on March 5, 2006, at the age of 70. David Parker Ray, known as the Toy Box Killer, was one of the most chilling serial killers in U.S. history, known for torturing and possibly murdering numerous women in New Mexico. Ray's crimes, spanning decades, revolved around a soundproof trailer, which he called the Toy Box. This horrific chamber was filled with torture devices, anatomical diagrams, and recorded messages used to terrify his victims. It's estimated he may have abducted and tortured up to 60 women, though the exact number of his victims remains unknown. Ray's early life was marked by trauma. Born in 1939 in New Mexico, he grew up in an abusive household where his father exposed him to violent pornography. Bullied and isolated as a child, Ray developed sadistic fantasies that grew into darker desires as he reached adulthood. Eventually, these fantasies became a terrifying reality when he constructed his torture chamber on wheels, allowing him to enact his sadistic desires in secret. The toy box was meticulously designed for psychological and physical torment. Inside, Ray used whips, chains, surgical tools, and other devices to torture his victims. One of his most disturbing methods involved playing pre-recorded messages that detailed the pain his captives would endure. Ray often worked with accomplices, including his girlfriend Cindy Hendy, to drug, abduct, and transport women to the toy box. Some victims were released with no memory of their ordeal, thanks to drugs used to erase their recollection. Others were believed to have been murdered, although no bodies were ever recovered. In 1999, the escape of one of his victims, Cynthia Vigil, broke open the case. Vigil managed to free herself from the toy box and, still chained, ran to a nearby house for help. Her escape led to the arrest of Ray and his accomplices. Another survivor, Angelica Montano, also came forward, providing crucial testimony that helped investigators build a case against him. Despite overwhelming evidence of his sadistic practices, including torture devices and journals found in his trailer, Ray never admitted to murder. He was convicted on multiple counts of kidnapping, assault, and torture in 2000 and sentenced to 224 years in prison. However, due to the lack of physical evidence, he was never convicted of any murders. Investigators searched areas around Elephant Butte Lake, suspecting he had disposed of bodies, but none were found. David Parker Ray died of a heart attack in 2002 while serving his sentence, leaving behind many unanswered questions about the full extent of his crimes. Peter Curtin, infamously known as the Vampire of Dusseldorf, terrorized Germany in the late 1920s with a string of brutal murders and assaults. His crimes, marked by extreme savagery and a disturbing fixation on blood, left the city of Dusseldorf paralyzed with fear. From a young age, he exhibited violent tendencies, escalating from animal cruelty and petty crimes to arson and violent robberies. His early adulthood was marked by frequent stints in prison. His first known victim was a young girl whom he stabbed repeatedly, returning later to drink her blood, a detail that earned him the notorious nickname. Over the next 2 years, Kürten's attacks became more frequent and increasingly brutal. He targeted victims of all ages, using weapons like scissors, hammers, and knives to inflict maximum pain. His bloodlust and sadism were unmatched, with Kürten taking pleasure not only in the act of killing but also in the fear he instilled in the people of Dusseldorf. One of the most unsettling aspects of Kürten's reign of terror was his ability to maintain a facade of normalcy. Despite being a sadistic killer, he led a seemingly ordinary life with his unsuspecting wife. This double life allowed him to evade capture for a considerable amount of time, even as the police intensified their efforts to stop the brutal attacks. Kürten's arrogance, however, became his undoing. In 1930, after killing an elderly woman named Maria Hahn, he sent taunting letters to the police, daring them to find her body. This led to a breakthrough in the investigation, and eventually, Kürten was arrested on May 24, 1930, thanks to one of his surviving victims. In custody, he confessed to over 70 crimes, including 9 murders. Kürten's trial captured national attention, with his cold, emotionless confessions shocking the public. Psychologists who studied him found him to be a sadistic psychopath who derived pleasure from others' pain, yet he was also intelligent and fully aware of the consequences of his actions. In 1931, Peter Kürten was sentenced to death and executed by guillotine. His final words, expressing a morbid curiosity about his own execution, encapsulated the dark nature of his personality. Jack Unterweger's life is a tragic and bizarre tale of crime, deception, and failed redemption. His early life was riddled with criminal activity, culminating in his conviction at age 24 for the brutal murder of Margaret Schaefer, a young woman strangled with her own bra. Sentenced to life in prison in 1974, Unterweger appeared to turn his life around while incarcerated, transforming into a celebrated writer. His works, including his autobiography Fegefeuer, Eine Reise ins Zuchthaus, Purgatory, A Trip to Prison, garnered widespread acclaim, convincing many that he was rehabilitated. Intellectuals, artists, and media figures rallied for his release, believing his literary success to be a sign of genuine reform. In 1990, after serving 15 years, Unterweger was granted parole. He quickly embraced his newfound freedom, becoming a public figure and symbol of rehabilitation in Austria. Writing for newspapers and appearing on television, Unterweger maintained a facade of reform. However, this persona hid a dark reality. Shortly after his release, he resumed killing, targeting prostitutes across Austria, Czechoslovakia, and the United States. His murders bore the same signature as his earlier crime, with many victims strangled using their own bras. Disturbingly, Unterweger used his position as a journalist to cover his crimes, even reporting on the murders he committed. In 1991, during a trip to Los Angeles, he murdered 3 sex workers while ostensibly covering the city's crime scene for an Austrian publication. This manipulation of his public role to continue his killing spree while evading suspicion is one of the most chilling aspects of his story. As investigations intensified, authorities connected the murders across Europe and the U.S. to Unterweger. In 1992, a warrant was issued for his arrest, prompting him to flee to the U.S. with his girlfriend. After a brief period on the run, he was arrested in Miami and extradited to Austria. In 1994, Unterweger was convicted of 9 murders and sentenced to life without parole. That same night, he hanged himself in his cell, using a rope made from his shoelaces, mirroring the method he used to kill his victims. Mikhail Popkov, notoriously known as the Werewolf or the Angarsk Maniac, is one of Russia's most terrifying serial killers, responsible for the brutal murders of at least 83 women between 1992 and 2010. Born in 1964, Popkov led a double life, working as a police officer in Angarsk, Siberia, which allowed him to escape suspicion for nearly 2 decades. His victims, primarily women, were lured under the guise of safety, often offered rides home. Once isolated in remote areas, he would rape and murder them, mutilating their bodies with savage tools like axes, knives, and screwdrivers. Popkov's murders were methodically calculated, targeting women he deemed immoral or unworthy, particularly those who had been drinking or were alone at night. He claimed that he was cleansing society of its flaws, portraying himself as a moral crusader, though his violent tendencies clearly stemmed from a deep desire for power and control. His ability to exploit his authority as a police officer made his crimes even more chilling, as he earned the trust of his victims before brutally betraying them. For years, bodies continued to surface in the Angarsk region, all displaying horrifying signs of mutilation. However, due to his position within law enforcement, Popkov remained hidden in plain sight, even participating in some of the investigations into his own murders. The growing number of victims prompted panic in the community, but the killer's identity remained elusive. It wasn't until 2012, thanks to advancements in DNA technology, that police were finally able to crack the case. DNA evidence linking Popkov's daughter to one of the crime scenes led investigators directly to him. Further incriminating evidence, such as matching tire tracks, sealed his fate. After his arrest, Popkov initially confessed to 22 murders, and in 2015, he was sentenced to life imprisonment. However, in a shocking revelation, he admitted to more killings while in prison. By 2018, he was convicted of 56 additional murders, raising his official count to 78, though he claims to have killed at least 83. His remorselessness and justifications for his actions, portraying his victims as women of low moral standing, highlighted his delusional sense of superiority and unchecked savagery. Donald Henry Pee Wee Gaskins stands as one of the most terrifying serial killers in American history, known for his ruthlessness and the sheer number of lives he claimed. Born on March 13, 1933, in Florence County, South Carolina, Gaskins endured a childhood of violence, neglect, and abuse, which would shape his future into one filled with horrific crimes. His reign of terror, spanning decades, left a trail of bodies and countless unanswered questions, as many of his victims remain unidentified. Gaskins' early life was filled with turmoil. Born small and weak, he earned the nickname Pee Wee, a name that stuck with him throughout his life. Raised in an unstable and violent household, Gaskins was subjected to physical abuse by his mother and her various partners. Without any parental care or guidance, he began engaging in petty crimes and rebellious behavior from a young age. By 11, Gaskins formed a gang with other troubled boys, committing burglaries and assaults on girls, foreshadowing the depravity that would later define his life. As a teenager, Gaskins was sent to reform school after being convicted of assaulting a girl with a hammer. During his time there, he was beaten by older boys, further hardening his already violent nature. He retaliated by becoming more dangerous and began to craft a persona of cruelty to protect himself. His reputation as a ruthless man grew, and upon his release in 1961, Gaskins returned to a life of crime. Though he initially tried to work as a roofer in Kearney, Gaskins' violent tendencies were far from over. By 1969, he began what he called his coastal kills, driving along South Carolina highways, abducting hitchhikers, predominantly women, and subjecting them to horrific acts of torture and murder. Gaskins referred to these killings as recreational murders, taking great pleasure in recounting them later. He estimated that he had killed anywhere between 80 to 110 people during this time, although law enforcement was never able to confirm the exact number. While his coastal kills were often opportunistic, Gaskins also committed what he termed serious murders, motivated by personal vendettas or financial gain. These murders were more calculated, often involving individuals he knew or had grudges against. One such instance was the brutal murder of his niece, whom he killed alongside her friend in a moment of rage. In another case, he murdered 13-year-old Janice Kirby and her friend Patricia Ann Alsbrook, both of whom had trusted him. As his reputation grew, Gaskins began killing for hire, offering his services to those looking to eliminate rivals or troublesome individuals. Gaskin's downfall came in 1975 when an accomplice, Walter Neely, was arrested and began cooperating with authorities. Neely led police to the shallow graves of several victims buried in rural South Carolina. Faced with mounting evidence, Gaskins was arrested and eventually convicted of 8 murders, though he confessed to many more. His trial became a spectacle, with Gaskins showing little remorse and even boasting about the various ways he had tortured and killed his victims. In 1976, Gaskins was sentenced to death, but his sentence was later commuted to life imprisonment when the U.S. Supreme Court temporarily abolished the death penalty. However, this wasn't the end of Gaskins' reign of terror. Even behind bars, Gaskins continued to kill. In 1982, he murdered fellow inmate Rudolph Tyner, who was on death row for killing a convenience store owner. Gaskins rigged a homemade bomb disguised as a radio and convinced Tyner to hold it near his head, promising it would help him hear better. When Tyner complied, Gaskins detonated the device, killing him instantly. This final act of brutality earned Gaskins another death sentence. On September 6, 1991, Gaskins was executed in the electric chair at the South Carolina Correctional Institution. William George Bonin, known as the Freeway Killer, became infamous as one of California's most brutal and prolific serial killers. Between 1979 and 1980, Bonin assaulted, tortured, and murdered at least 21 young boys and men in Southern California. Born on January 8, 1947, in Willimantic, Connecticut, his parents were alcoholics, and he endured severe abuse at the hands of his father and other family members. This abusive environment extended to sexual molestation by a family member, further warping Bonin's emotional development. In 1953, he and his brothers were placed in an orphanage, where he was subjected to further sexual and physical abuse. This traumatic upbringing had a profound impact on his psyche, contributing to the violent tendencies that would later emerge. By age 9, Bonin returned to live with his mother, but the damage was already done. As a teenager, Bonin began engaging in petty crimes and showed signs of emotional instability. By 18, he was arrested for stealing a car and assaulting a minor. He was sent to a California Youth Authority facility, where psychiatric evaluations revealed his lack of empathy and aggressive sexual tendencies. In 1969, Bonin, at the age of 22, was arrested for kidnapping, assaulting, and robbing 5 boys in Orange County, California. Sent to Atascadero State Hospital for evaluation, he was diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder and sexual sadism, conditions that pointed to his deep-seated desire to inflict pain on others for personal gratification. Despite these findings, Bonin was released after serving only a few years. Transferred to a regular prison, he continued to exhibit disturbing behavior. He was eventually granted parole in 1974, despite making no real progress in therapy. This failure of the justice system allowed Bonin to return to society, where his crimes escalated. From May 1979 to June 1980, Bonin and his accomplices abducted, tortured, and murdered at least 21 boys and young men, ranging in age from 12 to 19. Bonin targeted hitchhikers and young men he encountered at bus stops, luring them into his van, where the horror would unfold. His vehicle became a mobile torture chamber, equipped with ropes, knives, and ligatures. The details of Bonin's murders were grisly. He assaulted and tortured his victims, often strangling them with their own clothing or with ligatures he carried. In some cases, he stabbed or bludgeoned them to death. After killing his victims, Bonin discarded their bodies along Southern California's freeways, earning him the nickname Freeway Killer. His lack of remorse and enjoyment of his victims' suffering underscored his deeply sadistic nature. Bonin did not work alone. He recruited accomplices, including Vernon Butts, a factory worker, Gregory Miley, and James Monroe, who helped in both the abductions and murders. These accomplices later testified that they were coerced or manipulated by Bonin's dominant and twisted personality. Bonin's spree came to an end in June 1980. After receiving a tip from a former associate, police placed Bonin under surveillance. On June 11, 1980, they caught him in the act of attempting to assault a 15-year-old boy inside his van. Bonin was arrested, and a search of his vehicle uncovered tools of torture and murder. His trial, which took place in both Los Angeles and Orange counties, captivated the public. Bonin was charged with 14 murders in Los Angeles and an additional 4 in Orange County. His lack of remorse was chilling, as he often boasted about his crimes. His accomplices, including Butts, Miley, and Monroe, testified against him, providing graphic details of their involvement in the murders. In 1982, Bonin was convicted on multiple counts of murder, assault, and torture. He was sentenced to death for his crimes, and his accomplices received varying sentences. The case of the Doodler is a chilling, unsolved mystery from San Francisco's history, involving a serial killer who targeted the city's gay community between 1974 and 1975. During this period, at least 5 men, and possibly as many as 16, were brutally murdered. The perpetrator became known as the Doodler due to reports that he sketched his victims before killing them. Despite leads, including survivor testimonies and a potential suspect, the Doodler was never caught, leaving this case a haunting chapter in American crime history. In the 1970s, San Francisco was a sanctuary for LGBTQ+ individuals, especially in the Castro district, which had become a hub for the burgeoning gay rights movement. Despite the city's progressive reputation, violence against the LGBTQ+ community was still prevalent, and law enforcement often provided little protection. This social environment set the stage for the Doodler's attacks, which specifically targeted gay men and exposed the vulnerability of this community. The Doodler stood out due to his approach of using art as a means of seduction. According to survivors, he would meet men in gay bars or clubs where he would charm them by sketching their portraits. After gaining their trust, he would lure them to secluded areas where he would assault and stab them to death. His victims were left in remote locations, including parks and areas near the ocean, complicating efforts to gather evidence. The confirmed victims of the Doodler were all gay men. They included Gerald Kavanaugh, 50, found on Ocean Beach in January 1974. Joseph J. Stevens, 27, a drag performer, found in Golden Gate Park in June 1974. Klaus Christmann, 31, a German national, found near Ocean Beach in July 1974. Frederick Capon, 32, a Navy veteran, found in Golden Gate Park in May 1975. Harold Gullberg, 66, a Swedish immigrant, found on a golf course near the Pacific Ocean in June 1975. These victims had all been stabbed, and their bodies were left in isolated areas. There were no signs of robbery, suggesting that the motive was not financial, but rather driven by hatred or obsession. Remarkably, some men survived the Doodler's attacks and provided police with critical information. They described the killer as an African-American man, around 6 feet tall, in his late 20s, with a slim build and a soft-spoken demeanor. These survivors also revealed that the killer had sketched their portraits before attempting to murder them, a behavior that led to his infamous nickname. In 1976, police identified a potential suspect who fit the description and had been questioned by authorities. However, the case stalled when key witnesses, likely due to the stigma around homosexuality at the time, refused to publicly testify. Without their cooperation, authorities lacked sufficient evidence to charge the suspect, and the Doodler remained free. In 2018, the San Francisco Police Department reopened the case, offering a $100,000 reward for information leading to the killer's identification and conviction. In 2020, investigators revealed that they had re-interviewed a suspect who had been under surveillance since the 1970s. However, no formal charges have been filed, and the Doodler's identity remains a mystery. Authorities are also reviewing potential DNA evidence from the crime scenes, though no conclusive breakthroughs have been announced to date. Herb Baumeister's story is a haunting case of a seemingly successful businessman leading a double life as a serial killer. Known for owning a chain of thrift stores in Indiana, Baumeister was also responsible for the brutal murders of potentially over a dozen men, targeting members of the gay community in the early 1990s. The horrifying discoveries of human remains on his Fox Hollow Farm estate, along with his sudden suicide, left many unanswered questions, making him one of the more perplexing serial killers in American crime history. Herbert Richard Baumeister was born on April 7, 1947 in Indianapolis, Indiana. Despite being raised in a middle-class family, he exhibited disturbing behavior from an early age, such as playing with dead animals and urinating on a teacher's desk. His troubling actions led to a diagnosis of schizophrenia during his teenage years, though he never received adequate treatment. As Baumeister aged, he managed to lead a superficially successful life, holding various jobs and eventually marrying Juliana Julie Sider in the early 1980s, with whom he had 3 children. Baumeister's business success came in the mid-1980s when he founded Save-A-Lot, a thrift store chain that flourished. His family's move to the affluent Fox Hollow Farm estate in Westfield, Indiana, signaled outward success, but beneath the surface, Baumeister's personal life was crumbling. His marriage to Julie was strained, and they were largely estranged. Their intimate life was minimal, and Baumeister became increasingly withdrawn from family matters. While maintaining the image of a successful entrepreneur and family man, Baumeister led a secret life, frequenting gay bars in Indianapolis and engaging in violent acts that would soon be exposed. In the early 1990s, Indianapolis police were investigating the disappearances of several gay men, though leads were sparse. Concurrently, the I-70 Strangler was suspected in a series of murders involving gay men whose bodies were found along Interstate 70 in Indiana and Ohio. It wasn't until a man named Tony Harris came forward with information that Baumeister emerged as a suspect. Harris described meeting a man who went by the name Brian Smart at a gay bar, who took him to a secluded suburban home and engaged in erotic asphyxiation while boasting about previous murders. Harris survived the encounter and later identified Brian Smart as Herb Baumeister. Despite Harris's claims, police struggled to advance their investigation as Baumeister refused to allow a search of his estate. It wasn't until 1996 when Julie Baumeister, growing increasingly suspicious of her husband, permitted police to search the property while Baumeister was away. What they uncovered was nothing short of horrific. Scattered across the grounds of Fox Hollow Farm were the skeletal remains of at least 11 men, with estimates suggesting as many as 25 victims. The remains were often burned, dismembered, and hidden across the 18-acre estate, confirming Baumeister as a serial killer. As investigators moved to arrest Baumeister, he fled to Canada, staying in various hotels to avoid capture. On July 3, 1996, he was found dead by suicide in Pinery Provincial Park in Ontario, having shot Ed. In his suicide note, Baumeister did not mention the murders, instead blaming his actions on financial issues and marital problems, leaving the case unresolved and full of speculation. One of the most significant lingering questions about Herb Baumeister is his potential connection to the I-70 Strangler murders, which occurred between 1980 and 1991. These killings involved the bodies of gay men found along the interstate, many of whom were strangled. The method of disposal and victim profiles were similar to Baumeister's later crimes, leading to widespread belief that Baumeister may have been responsible for both sets of murders. However, with his death, no conclusive evidence tying him to the I-70 murders has been established. Todd Kohlhepp, a successful South Carolina real estate agent, shocked the nation when his double life as a serial killer was exposed in 2016. Though he was outwardly prosperous and well-regarded, Kohlhepp harbored dark, violent tendencies that led to the murders of at least 7 people over the span of more than a decade. His horrifying story, which included the chilling discovery of a woman held captive on his property, revealed a pattern of violence, manipulation, and control that had been hidden behind his professional success. Born on March 7, 1971, Todd Kohlhepp had a troubled childhood filled with aggression, violent tendencies, and an inability to form meaningful connections with others. After his parents divorced when he was 2, Kohlhepp struggled with his relationship with his mother and stepfather. His troubling behavior, which included destroying toys and harming animals, raised concerns but did not lead to effective intervention. At 15, Kohlhepp committed his first violent crime in Tempe, Arizona. He kidnapped and sexually assaulted a 14-year-old at gunpoint, threatening to kill her family if she reported the crime. The girl bravely came forward, and Kohlhepp was arrested, tried as an adult, and sentenced to 15 years in prison. His psychological evaluations revealed deep-seated issues, including borderline personality disorder and an obsession with violence and firearms. Kohlhepp served 14 years in prison before being released in 2001. After his release, Kohlhepp moved to South Carolina and seemingly rebuilt his life. He earned a degree in computer science and in 2006 obtained his real estate license, despite his criminal background, by lying on his application. Kohlhepp founded TKA Real Estate, quickly gaining success and a good reputation as a broker in the Spartanburg area. Behind his business facade, however, Kohlhepp remained a dangerous man. His colleagues described him as controlling and aggressive, often boasting about his firearm collection and survivalist skills. These troubling behaviors were dismissed or ignored by those around him, unaware of the violent secrets Kohlhepp was hiding. On November 6, 2003, 4 people were murdered execution-style at Superbike Motorsports, a motorcycle shop in Chesnee, South Carolina. The victims were shop owner Scott Ponder, service manager Brian Lucas, mechanic Chris Sherbert, and bookkeeper Beverly Guy. For over a decade, the case went unsolved, leaving the local community in shock. In 2016, after his arrest, Kohlhepp confessed to the Superbike Motorsports murders, providing chilling details of the crime. He revealed that he had killed the 4 victims after feeling humiliated by the shop employees, who had mocked him when he struggled to ride a motorcycle he had purchased. Kohlhepp returned later with a gun, methodically shooting all 4 employees in cold blood. His confession finally brought closure to a case that had stumped investigators for years. Kohlhepp's secret life unraveled in August 2016, when Kala Brown and her boyfriend, Charles David Carver, went missing after going to Kohlhepp's property to do some work. When their families couldn't reach them, the disappearance sparked an investigation. Suspicion grew when strange messages appeared on Carver's Facebook, leading police to Kohlhepp's rural property in Woodruff, South Carolina. On November 3, 2016, investigators made a shocking discovery. Kala Brown was found alive, chained inside a metal storage container on Kohlhepp's property. She had been held captive for 2 months and subjected to physical and psychological abuse. Brown revealed that Kohlhepp had murdered her boyfriend, Charles Carver, shortly after their arrival, burying his body on the property. Brown's rescue led to Kohlhepp's arrest, and further investigation revealed even more victims. After his arrest, Kohlhepp confessed to a total of 7 murders. In addition to the Superbike Motorsports killings and the murder of Charles Carver, he admitted to killing Johnny and Megan Coxey, a couple who had gone missing in December 2015. The Coxeys, like Brown and Carver, had been hired to do work on Kohlhepp's property before being murdered. Their bodies were discovered buried on his land, with both having been shot to death. Investigators believe there may be more victims, given Kohlhepp's confession and the evidence found on his property. Kohlhepp's willingness to talk about his crimes, coupled with the length of time he had operated without being caught, suggests a deeper level of depravity. In May 2017, Todd Kohlhepp pleaded guilty to 7 counts of murder, along with charges of kidnapping and sexual assault. In exchange for his cooperation in locating victims' remains, he avoided the death penalty and was sentenced to 7 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. The Dnepropetrovsk maniacs case from 2007 is one of the most gruesome in criminal history, notable for the youth of the killers and the senseless brutality of their crimes. Viktor Sayenko and Igor Suprunyuk, both teenagers from Dnipro, Ukraine, embarked on a killing spree that left 21 people dead in under a month. The pair recorded some of their murders, which added to the infamy of the case. The 2 young men, who had been friends since childhood, bonded over shared interests in cruelty, starting with torturing animals. Their crimes escalated to random, brutal killings of people in parks, quiet streets, and isolated areas. Their victims ranged from elderly people to children, often attacked with hammers, pipes, and screwdrivers. The killers showed no remorse or pattern in their choice of victims, and many of their murders were opportunistic, fueled by a desire for thrills rather than any discernible motive like financial gain or personal grudges. One of the most infamous aspects of the case is a video titled 3 Guys, 1 Hammer, in which the pair filmed the torture and murder of a 48-year-old man, Serhiy Yatsenko. The video, which later spread across the internet, showed Yatsenko being bludgeoned and stabbed while the killers mocked him. The cruelty and the cold detachment displayed in the footage horrified viewers and remains one of the most notorious true crime videos ever leaked. The police eventually caught the pair by tracing mobile phones they had stolen from their victims. After selling a phone to a pawn shop, the police linked the sale to the killers and arrested them in 2007. In their homes, investigators found disturbing evidence, including photos and videos of the killers with their victims. Sayenko and Suprunyuk were convicted of 21 murders in 2009, receiving life sentences. A third accomplice, Alexander Hanza, who had only sold stolen goods, was sentenced to 9 years in prison. The case baffled many because the killers did not fit the typical profile of serial murderers. They were from stable, middle-class families and had no clear psychological issues that could explain the brutality of their actions. They claimed to have committed the murders simply for excitement and to see what it felt like to take a life. Some reports suggest they were trying to create a collection of memories by photographing their victims. Karl Denke, known as the Cannibal of Ziembice, was a German serial killer whose acts of murder, cannibalism, and body part harvesting shocked the small town of Münsterberg, modern-day Ziembice, Poland, in the early 20th century. His unsuspecting appearance as a kind, elderly man allowed him to lure victims into his home, where he committed heinous crimes that were only uncovered upon his arrest in 1924. Denke's case, though less widely known today, ranks him among history's most disturbing killers. Karl Denke was born on August 11, 1870, in Oberkunzendorf, near Münsterberg, then part of Germany. His upbringing was marked by challenges, including the early loss of his parents. He inherited and sold his family farm, but struggled to find stability, trying out various jobs throughout his life. As a child, Denke was introverted, socially awkward, and isolated, traits that persisted into adulthood. By the early 1900s, Denke settled in Münsterberg, where he purchased a small home and lived alone. Despite his odd personality, the townspeople viewed him as a harmless, generous man who often provided food and shelter to those in need. He was also deeply involved with the local church, even playing the organ at services. The community's perception of Denke as a benevolent, if eccentric figure, would make the revelation of his crimes all the more shocking. His killing spree, which lasted for years, targeted vulnerable individuals, mostly homeless people, vagrants, and travelers. These individuals, transient and disconnected from local society, made perfect victims, as their disappearances were unlikely to be reported. Denke would offer them food or shelter, luring them into his home, where he would murder them. His typical method of killing involved blunt force trauma to the head or strangulation, after which he would dismember the bodies with expert precision. The most chilling aspect of Denke's crimes was his preservation of human remains. Investigators later discovered jars filled with preserved human flesh in brine, bones, and evidence suggesting that Denke had consumed or sold human meat. He kept a meticulous ledger documenting the names of his victims and recording the weight of their bodies and meat. Some suspect that Denke sold this flesh as pork to unsuspecting neighbors, though this remains speculative. Denke's reign of terror ended abruptly on December 21, 1924. His capture came after a homeless man named Vincenz Olivier escaped from Denke's house following a violent attack. Olivier, covered in blood, ran into the street and alerted authorities. When police arrested Denke, they were initially skeptical that the elderly, church-going man could have committed such a crime. However, a search of his home revealed an unimaginable horror: human bones, preserved flesh, and tools used for butchery. Denke's ledger listed the names of 42 victims, though the true number may be higher. Despite the overwhelming evidence, Denke never faced trial for his crimes. He hanged himself in his jail cell on December 22, 1924, just one day after his arrest, leaving many questions unanswered. Alexander Pichushkin, the chessboard killer or Bitsa Park maniac, is one of Russia's most infamous serial killers. Known for his goal to murder 64 people, one for each square on a chessboard, he killed at least 48 individuals, though he claimed to have killed 60. Most of his victims were vulnerable, such as elderly men and homeless individuals, lured into Moscow's Bitsa Park with offers of vodka and friendship. Once he gained their trust, he brutally killed them with a hammer or threw them into sewer wells, leaving them to die slowly. Pichushkin was born on April 9, 1974, in Mytishchi near Moscow. At the age of 4, he suffered a severe head injury, which may have contributed to his later aggressive behavior. He became withdrawn, was bullied by classmates, and developed a strong interest in chess. Encouraged by his grandfather, he honed his skills in the game, often playing with elderly men in the park. Chess would later symbolize his obsession with murder, as he envisioned completing a chessboard with victims. Pichushkin's killings began in 1992 when he murdered a classmate. However, his spree escalated in 2001. Pichushkin saw murder as a way to assert dominance and feel godlike power over life and death, rather than for sexual gratification. His lack of empathy was evident. During his trial, he admitted to enjoying the murders and felt disappointed that he didn't complete his goal. Pichushkin was arrested in 2006 after his final victim, Marina Moskalyova, left a note indicating she was meeting him. This clue led to his capture, and investigators found a chessboard at his home with 61 marked squares. Pichushkin confessed to 61 murders, though he was convicted of 48. During his trial in 2007, Pichushkin remained calm and detached, showing no remorse. He even expressed frustration that life imprisonment was too lenient, wishing for the death penalty, which Russia had abolished. He was sentenced to life in prison, with the first 15 years in solitary confinement. His trial remains one of Russia's most significant criminal cases, leaving a lasting impact on the country. Juan Corona, a Mexican-American serial killer, was responsible for the brutal murders of at least 25 migrant workers in California during the early 1970s. His spree is considered one of the deadliest in U.S. history at the time. In 1971, the bodies of his victims were uncovered in shallow graves across farms near Yuba City, California, revealing the horror of his actions. Corona's violent temper, history of mental illness, and detachment from his crimes made the case particularly shocking. Born on February 7, 1934, in Atlan, Jalisco, Mexico, Juan Corona grew up in a poor farming family and moved to the U.S. in 1950. Working as a migrant farm laborer, he eventually settled in Yuba City by the early 1960s as a labor contractor. This role allowed him to hire farmhands, ultimately enabling him to select his victims from transient workers. Corona's life took a dark turn in 1956, when he suffered a mental breakdown and was diagnosed with schizophrenia. He was briefly institutionalized and underwent electroshock therapy, but was released. Despite ongoing mental health issues, he married and had 4 daughters, though his psychological struggles would later manifest violently. Corona's killing spree began in late 1970 or early 1971. He preyed on vulnerable men, including migrant workers, drifters, and alcoholics, promising them farm work. Once isolated, he would attack them, often with a machete or knife, from behind, slit their necks, swing them. Some victims were also shot, mutilated, or bound. After killing them, Corona buried their bodies in shallow graves on farms. The victims were transient workers with few connections, so their disappearances went unnoticed. It wasn't until May 1971, when a farmer discovered a suspiciously dug hole, that the murders were uncovered. This led to a broader investigation, resulting in the exhumation of 25 bodies, all linked to Corona. Corona quickly became the prime suspect due to his position as a labor contractor. Authorities found critical evidence, including a ledger containing the names of some victims, and blood-stained knives, a machete, and a pistol in his possession. His truck, also stained with blood, further implicated him. In 1971, he was arrested and charged with the murders. During his trial, Corona's defense highlighted his schizophrenia and previous institutionalization, but the prosecution demonstrated that his actions were premeditated. In 1973, he was convicted of 25 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to life without parole. Corona never fully confessed, leaving his exact motive unclear. Some attribute his actions to his mental illness, while others believe deep-seated anger drove him. His meticulous selection of victims, isolated, marginalized men, suggests a predatory mindset, perhaps fueled by a desire for control. The brutality of the murders, with many victims suffering head and facial trauma, hints at rage beyond simple homicide. Despite his conviction, Corona maintained his innocence and was retried in 1982, but was again found guilty. He spent the rest of his life in prison, dying in 2019 at age 85. Luis Garavito, infamously known as La Bestia, the Beast, is one of the world's most prolific serial killers, responsible for the deaths of at least 138 children, with estimates suggesting his actual victim count could exceed 300. Garavito's gruesome murders primarily took place in Colombia during the 1990s, but evidence suggests he also operated in Ecuador and Venezuela. His victims were mainly young boys, often from impoverished backgrounds, whom he lured with false promises, only to torture, abuse, and murder them. The scale and brutality of Garavito's crimes shocked Colombia and the world, earning him a reputation as one of history's most sadistic killers. Luis Alfredo Garavito Cubillos was born on January 25, 1957 in Genova, Quindío, Colombia, into a life of poverty and abuse. His father, an alcoholic, was violently abusive, and Garavito later claimed he was truly abused by a neighbor as a child. These early traumas are believed to have shaped his disturbed psyche. He was a troubled child, often withdrawn and struggled academically. In his teens, he ran away from home and began working low-paying jobs. Garavito battled alcoholism and suffered from emotional instability throughout his early adult life. He moved frequently and struggled to hold steady employment, all the while harboring violent, predatory urges that would manifest in horrific ways. Garavito's murder spree is believed to have begun in 1992, though it may have started earlier. He preyed on boys between the ages of 6 and 16, often from vulnerable backgrounds, such as street children or those working as shoe shiners and vendors. He would gain their trust by offering them money, food, or work. Posing as a priest, charity worker, or authority figure, he lured them to secluded areas where he would tie them up, assault them, and brutally kill them. Many of his victims were decapitated, and their bodies were found in remote fields, ravines, or wooded areas. The gruesome nature of the murders, marked by extreme torture and mutilation, instilled fear across Colombia. The scale of the killings initially went unnoticed, as the victims were often transient or from marginalized communities. However, as more bodies were discovered, investigators recognized a horrifying pattern. Garavito's methods were methodical. He selected boys who were unlikely to be missed and covered his tracks by frequently changing locations. Garavito was apprehended in 1999 due to a critical mistake. He attempted to abduct a boy who managed to escape and report the incident to the police. Initially detained for attempted assault, investigators soon realized they had captured the man responsible for the string of child murders that had terrorized Colombia. During the investigation, police found multiple identification documents under false names and physical evidence linking him to the murders. When confronted, Garavito eventually confessed to the murder of 138 children, providing specific details that helped authorities recover many victims' remains. Garavito was convicted of multiple counts of murder, and while the confirmed number of victims stands at 138, investigators believe the true total is closer to 300. Colombian law limits prison sentences to 40 years, and because Garavito cooperated with authorities, his sentence was further reduced to 22 years. Luis Garavito died in a hospital in Valledupar on October 12, 2023, at the age of 66. Though incarcerated, the possibility of his early release had been a point of contention in Colombia for years, sparking calls for reforms to the country's criminal justice system. Benjamin Atkins, also known as the Woodward Corridor Killer, was a serial killer who brutally murdered 11 women over a span of less than a year. His killing spree, from December 1991 to August 1992, terrorized the Detroit area, particularly along the Woodward Corridor, an area known for high crime, drug addiction, and prostitution. What makes Atkins' case stand out is the sheer speed and ferocity of his murders, compounded by the traumatic history that shaped him into a violent predator. Atkins was born in 1968, and from an early age, his life was marked by extreme hardship. Abandoned by his mother, he was left to navigate a world filled with violence and neglect. His childhood was a nightmare of abuse, both physical and emotional. At the age of 10, Atkins was reportedly an experience that would haunt him throughout his life. By the time he reached his teenage years, Atkins was already displaying signs of significant mental illness. He became socially withdrawn, struggled with homelessness, and began abusing drugs. His encounters with law enforcement were mostly for minor crimes, giving no indication of the violent predator he would later become. However, beneath the surface, Atkins harbored deep-seated rage and resentment, particularly toward women, feelings he would later attribute to his feelings of abandonment by his mother. Atkins' murderous spree began in December 1991. Over the next 8 months, he claimed the lives of 11 women, primarily targeting prostitutes and drug addicts, who he viewed as symbols of his mother's neglect. Atkins would lure his victims into abandoned buildings, where he would slowly assault and strangle them. His killing grounds were often within the Woodward Corridor, a notorious strip in Detroit known for its high rates of prostitution and drug use. This association earned him the nickname Woodward Corridor Killer. One of the most shocking aspects of Atkins's killing spree was the rapid escalation of his murders. Serial killers often have cooling-off periods between killings, but Atkins' spree was marked by a sense of urgency, possibly driven by his deteriorating mental state. In less than a year, he murdered 11 women, an unusually high number for such a short time frame. Atkins was careful, leaving little forensic evidence at the crime scenes, and few witnesses were willing to come forward, as the areas where he operated were dangerous and plagued by crime. Despite these challenges, law enforcement eventually identified similarities in the murders and locations, which led them to investigate further. In August 1992, Atkins was arrested on unrelated charges, and during questioning, he shocked investigators by confessing to the murders of 11 women. He described his methods in chilling detail and expressed no remorse, citing his hatred for prostitutes, which stemmed from his abusive childhood. In 1994, Atkins pleaded guilty to the murders and was sentenced to 11 life sentences without the possibility of parole. His trial included testimony about his traumatic upbringing, but this did little to mitigate the severity of his crimes. In 1997, just 3 years after his conviction, he died of complications related to HIV/AIDS. His death closed the chapter on a life that had been marked by suffering and inflicted immense pain on his victims and their families. Tsutomu Miyazaki, also known as the Otaku Murderer, was a notorious Japanese serial killer whose horrific crimes between 1988 and 1989 left a deep scar on Japan's psyche. Over a span of less than 2 years, Miyazaki abducted and murdered 4 young girls, ages 4 to 7, in a string of grotesque and disturbing acts. His case is unique, not only because of the brutality of his crimes, but also because of the terrifying way he tormented the families of his victims. By sending letters and remains of the children to their grieving parents, Miyazaki heightened the horror of his murders, escalating the terror he inflicted. Born on August 21, 1962, Tsutomu Miyazaki's childhood was marked by physical and emotional hardship. He was born prematurely with a deformity that fused his wrists and forearms, making him a target of bullying and social isolation. His wealthy but emotionally distant family provided little comfort, leading Miyazaki to withdraw into a fantasy world fueled by manga, horror films, and anime. Over time, his interests became increasingly violent and grotesque, as his fascination with death and brutality intensified. This detachment from reality, combined with his psychological issues, would later manifest in his violent behavior. Miyazaki's crimes began in August 1988, when he abducted his first victim, a 4-year-old girl. He lured her into his car, drove her to a remote area, and strangled her to death. After killing her, he mutilated her body, committing acts of necrophilia and cannibalism. He took photographs of her corpse, which he later kept as trophies to relive the experience. Over the next year, Miyazaki would kill 3 more girls in similarly horrific fashion. What made Miyazaki particularly notorious was not just the gruesome nature of his murders, but the way he continued to torment the victims' families. In one instance, he sent a postcard to the parents of one of his victims, describing in detail how he had killed their daughter. In another chilling act, Miyazaki mailed bones, teeth, and photographs of the remains to a victim's family, ensuring their suffering was prolonged. This sadistic behavior, along with his refusal to show any remorse, earned him the nickname the Human Dracula. Miyazaki's crimes triggered a national panic, not only because of their brutality, but also due to his connections to Japan's growing otaku subculture. When Miyazaki was arrested in July 1989 after attempting to abduct another girl, police discovered an extensive collection of violent and pornographic media in his home, including slasher films, anime, and manga. This discovery led to intense media scrutiny and moral panic over the possible influence of such content on young people. Miyazaki was quickly labeled the otaku murderer, and his case ignited debates about the dangers of otaku culture, violent media, and how society deals with those who consume it. During his trial, Miyazaki showed no remorse for his actions. He claimed that an alter ego named Ratman had driven him to commit the murders, attempting to deflect responsibility by framing his crimes as the product of mental illness. His defense team argued that he was suffering from dissociative identity disorder and schizophrenia, seeking to have him declared insane. However, psychiatric evaluations concluded that while Miyazaki was deeply disturbed, he was fully aware of his actions at the time of the murders. The court rejected the insanity plea, and he was sentenced to death in 1997. Miyazaki's case left a lasting impact on Japanese society, raising difficult questions about mental illness, media influence, and personal responsibility. His trial and subsequent media coverage highlighted Japan's struggle to reconcile the actions of an individual with societal failures to provide adequate mental health care and oversight. While the violent media he consumed was seen as a contributing factor, it was clear that Miyazaki's psychological issues stemmed from much deeper personal trauma and isolation. After a lengthy appeals process, Tsutomu Miyazaki was hanged on June 17, 2008. He remained unrepentant until the end, showing no remorse for his actions or the suffering he had caused. Ervil LeBaron was a fundamentalist Mormon leader who led the Church of the Firstborn of the Lamb of God, a polygamous sect he controlled through fear and violence. Born in 1925, LeBaron was raised in a family that had already broken away from mainstream Mormonism to pursue fundamentalist practices, such as polygamy. He eventually claimed to be the rightful successor of his father's leadership within their church, but this claim was contested by his brothers, leading to violent internal conflict. LeBaron's belief in blood atonement, a doctrine suggesting that some sins could only be forgiven through the shedding of blood, became a driving force in his rise to power. According to this belief, anyone who opposed or betrayed him was committing a grievous sin, which he interpreted as requiring their death. This radical interpretation led him to order a series of murders over the next several years. In 1972, LeBaron ordered the assassination of his brother, Joel LeBaron, who was one of his chief rivals for leadership of their church. This marked the beginning of a long string of killings orchestrated by LeBaron to eliminate opposition and consolidate his control. He commanded his followers to carry out the murders, manipulating their religious beliefs to maintain obedience. By convincing them that these killings were sanctioned by God, LeBaron was able to foster a dangerous cult of personality. Over time, Ervil LeBaron's list of enemies grew longer, and he began to target not only his religious rivals, but also former followers, ex-wives, and even family members who dared to leave his church or challenge his authority. At least 20 murders were attributed to his orders, including that of Rulon Allred, a rival polygamist leader who headed the Apostolic United Brethren, another fundamentalist Mormon sect. In 1979, after years of terror and bloodshed, LeBaron was arrested and tried for ordering Allred's murder. During the trial, it became clear how deeply LeBaron's influence had penetrated his sect. Many of his followers, indoctrinated with his twisted theology, had been willing to kill on his behalf, believing that they were fulfilling divine mandates. LeBaron was convicted and sentenced to life in prison, but his death in 1981 from a heart attack did little to end the violence. Even after his death, LeBaron's teachings continued to wreak havoc. He had left behind a hit list, known as the Book of the New Covenant, which outlined the names of those he believed needed to be eliminated to purify his church. His most fervent followers continued to carry out murders based on this list for years. The cult-like devotion he instilled in them ensured that the violence did not stop with his imprisonment or his death. Adolfo Constanzo, a notorious cult leader, drug dealer, and serial killer, gained infamy during the 1980s for blending Santeria, Palo Mayombe, and witchcraft with his violent criminal enterprise. Leading a drug-smuggling cult, Constanzo orchestrated a series of ritualistic murders, ultimately sacrificing over a dozen victims in the belief that these acts would provide supernatural protection for his cartel. His reign of terror, which included mutilations and human sacrifices, ended after authorities tracked him down, following the discovery of a mass grave on a ranch in Matamoros, Mexico. Adolfo de Jesus Constanzo was born on November 1, 1962, in Miami, Florida, to a Cuban immigrant mother. Raised in an environment steeped in Afro-Caribbean religions, he was exposed to the practices of Santeria and Palo Mayombe from an early age. His mother, a devout follower of these belief systems, introduced him to the rituals, which frequently involved animal sacrifices. As Constanzo grew older, his fascination with the darker aspects of these religions intensified. Palo Mayombe, in particular, captivated him due to its focus on harnessing the power of spirits and the use of human remains in rituals. During his late teens, Constanzo spent time in Mexico City, where he established himself as a practitioner of the occult, offering spiritual consultations and performing rituals for wealthy clients. His charisma, combined with his perceived ability to predict the future and manipulate outcomes, earned him a following. As his reputation grew, Constanzo became known as a powerful sorcerer in criminal circles, using his knowledge of Palo Mayombe to offer protection to drug traffickers and criminals. His influence grew as he conducted increasingly elaborate ceremonies that included animal sacrifices and eventually human sacrifices. The cult conducted these rites at a ranch in Matamoros, Mexico, which became a site of horrific acts involving mutilation and torture. Constanzo's descent into violence escalated as his cult's rituals became more extreme. The group believed that human sacrifices would offer greater spiritual power, and they began abducting and murdering individuals for use in their ceremonies. The cult preyed on young, healthy men, whom Constanzo believed would provide the most potent spiritual energy. The victims were tortured, dismembered, and their body parts were used in various rituals. In March 1989, the disappearance of 21-year-old University of Texas student Mark Kilroy marked the beginning of Constanzo's downfall. Kilroy had been on spring break in Matamoros when he was abducted by Constanzo's cult. His disappearance led to a massive investigation, and authorities soon discovered a mass grave on Constanzo's ranch. The remains of Kilroy and several other victims were found, their bodies mutilated in ways that indicated they had been used in grisly rituals. The discovery shocked the world, shedding light on the horrific practices of Constanzo's cult. The uncovering of the mass grave led to an intense manhunt for Constanzo and his followers. Realizing that authorities were closing in, Constanzo fled to Mexico City with several members of his inner circle. For weeks, they managed to evade capture, hiding in an apartment while Constanzo continued to perform rituals, believing they would protect him from the police. However, in May 1989, law enforcement tracked down Constanzo's hideout. When police surrounded the apartment, Constanzo, unwilling to be captured alive, ordered one of his followers to shoot him. On May 6, 1989, Constanzo was killed by one of his disciples, bringing an end to his violent reign. Even in his final moments, he remained defiant, refusing to surrender to the authorities. Bevan Spencer van Einem is an Australian convicted murderer, infamous for the brutal 1983 killing of 15-year-old Richard Kelvin. His crime is tied to the notorious family murders that haunted Adelaide during the 1970s and 1980s. The victims, all young males, were abducted, drugged, assaulted, and tortured before being killed. Van Einem was convicted solely of Kelvin's murder, but authorities suspect he may have been part of a larger group involved in other killings linked to the family murders. Born in 1945, Van Einem grew up in Adelaide and worked as a bookkeeper. Outwardly, he was a respectable member of society, living a quiet, middle-class life. However, he led a disturbing double life, preying on young men. Adelaide, during this period, was gripped by a series of horrific murders, with each victim suffering similar brutalities before their deaths. Police initially didn't connect von Einem to these murders until the investigation into Richard Kelvin's disappearance. Kelvin, the son of a local news presenter, went missing on June 5, 1983. His abduction sparked a widespread search due to his high-profile family. Nearly 2 months later, his body was found, revealing he had been held captive for weeks. Kelvin was repeatedly drugged, tortured, and abused, showing signs of prolonged suffering. Forensic evidence, including fibers from von Einem's home and car, linked him to the crime. Despite his denials, von Einem was convicted of Kelvin's murder in 1984 and sentenced to life in prison. Although convicted only of Kelvin's murder, police believed von Einem's involvement extended to other victims, including Alan Barnes, Neil Muir, Mark Langley, and Peter Stogneff, all of whom were killed in a similar manner. The term family was coined to describe a possible secretive network of wealthy and influential individuals allegedly involved in these murders. Witnesses even claimed von Einem had bragged about committing such acts with others. However, no further charges were brought against him, leaving the full scope of his involvement in the family murders unresolved. In prison, von Einem has maintained his innocence regarding the other murders, though he has admitted to some criminal activity. He has faced repeated parole denials due to his lack of remorse and the severity of his crime. His case remains one of South Australia's most notorious, and he has been attacked multiple times by fellow inmates. The Monster of Florence is one of Italy's most notorious unsolved serial murder cases, spanning nearly 2 decades between 1968 and 1985. An unknown assailant is believed to have murdered at least 16 individuals, primarily targeting young couples in secluded areas near Florence. The couples were often attacked during intimate moments in their cars, making the murders particularly disturbing. The killer used a .22 caliber Beretta pistol to shoot the victims, followed by mutilating the female bodies, indicating a deeply sadistic and misogynistic streak. The first known murders occurred in 1968, when Antonio Lobianco and Barbara Locci were shot to death. Initially, the crime was dismissed as a jealous lover's act, leading to a wrongful conviction. It wasn't until the mid-1970s that a pattern emerged, linking this crime to a string of similar murders. From 1974 to 1985, the killer targeted couples parked in rural lovers' lanes. The similarities in the methods of attack and mutilation became clear, and the murders shocked the peaceful Tuscan region, with the media dubbing the killer the Monster of Florence. The investigation into the Monster of Florence case was marked by a series of errors, competing theories, and wrongful arrests. It wasn't until 1981 that law enforcement officially acknowledged the connection between the murders, sparked by the killings of Susanna Cambi and Stefano Baldi. Despite connecting the murders through ballistics and forensic evidence, the investigation struggled with leads. One of the most infamous suspects was Pietro Pacciani, a local farmer with a violent past. Pacciani was convicted in 1994, but controversially acquitted in 1996, throwing the case into further disarray. Theories regarding the killer's identity abounded. Some investigators suspected that the killings were linked to a secret society or occult rituals, given the ritualistic nature of the female mutilations. Others believed the monster was a lone, sexually deviant individual with deep psychological issues. The theory of multiple accomplices gained traction with the arrest of Pacciani's associates, Mario Vanni and Giancarlo Lotti, but this theory was widely criticized. Lotti confessed, but later contradicted himself, leading to more doubts about the validity of the group theory. Adding to the complexity, journalist Mario Spessi, who had covered the case extensively, became a suspect in 2006 after criticizing the investigation in his writings. His arrest sparked international outrage, and he was eventually released, but his involvement highlighted the chaotic nature of the case and the blurred lines between investigation and media sensationalism. The Monster of Florence case left a profound mark on Italian society, exposing flaws in the justice system, with frequent missteps and botched investigations hindering progress. It became a media sensation, but the heightened public interest didn't lead to a resolution. Decades later, the case remains unsolved, with many believing the real killer may have died or eluded justice. The Oakland County child killer is one of Michigan's most infamous unsolved criminal cases. Between 1976 and 1977, at least 4 children were abducted and murdered in the Oakland County suburbs near Detroit. The victims, 2 boys and 2 girls, were held captive for days, only to be found dead and carefully groomed, suggesting a methodical and disturbing killer. Despite extensive investigations and numerous suspects, the case remains unsolved, haunting the community to this day. The string of murders began in February 1976 with the abduction of 12-year-old Mark Stebbins, who disappeared while walking home from the American Legion Hall in Ferndale. His body was found 4 days later, neatly dressed but showing signs of sexual assault and suffocation. In December of the same year, 12-year-old Jill Robinson vanished after an argument with her mother. She was found the next day, shot in the face, near Interstate 75. Unlike Stebbins, she was not sexually assaulted, but the brutal and calculated nature of her death was chilling. In January 1977, 10-year-old Christine Mihelich disappeared after going to a local 7-Eleven. 19 days later, her body was found in a ditch, strangled but fully clothed, adding to the growing panic in Oakland County. The final known victim was 11-year-old Timothy King, who disappeared in March 1977 after going to a pharmacy in Birmingham to buy candy. 6 days later, his body was discovered in a shallow ditch. Like Stebbins, he had been salted and suffocated. The OCCK case was terrifying because of the clear pattern in the killings. All the victims were preteens abducted from public places, held captive for days, and then murdered. Their bodies were left in various locations across Oakland County, always cleaned and dressed, showing an unusual level of care by the killer. This meticulousness, combined with the ability to evade capture, indicated a highly organized and calculating individual, or group, behind the crimes. The Oakland County child killer investigation became one of the largest manhunts in U.S. history. Authorities, including the FBI, received hundreds of tips and interviewed numerous suspects, yet no arrests were made. One prominent suspect was Christopher Bush, the son of a General Motors executive with a history of abusing young boys. Though he was questioned, Bush was never formally charged and was found dead in 1978 in what appeared to be a suicide. Many believe Bush may have been involved, but definitive proof has never been found. Another suspect, Archibald Edward Sloan, became a person of interest when hair samples from his car were linked to the case. However, the evidence was inconclusive, and he denied any involvement. There were also theories that the murders were connected to a nationwide child porn ring, but this theory, while plausible, has never been proven. The Zebra murders stand as one of San Francisco's most chilling unsolved crime sprees, carried out between 1973 and 1974. A series of racially motivated killings claimed the lives of at least 15 people, plunging the city into fear. The perpetrators, driven by a radical ideology targeting white victims, conducted their murders with a brutality that shocked both the public and law enforcement. The crimes became known as the Zebra murders, named after the police radio code used in the investigation. The killing spree began on October 19, 1973, when a young couple, one white man and a black woman, were attacked in Golden Gate Park. Over the next several months, the attacks escalated, with the killers mainly targeting white people in random and brutal assaults. The victims were often stabbed or shot, their murders carried out in public spaces and at vulnerable times, such as late at night or early in the morning. The city's fear grew as the body count rose. In total, at least 15 people were killed and many others were injured. The randomness of the attacks left San Francisco's predominantly white neighborhoods on edge. The killers showed no remorse and took steps to evade capture, adding to the growing paranoia in the community. The killers were linked to a radical sect within the Nation of Islam, and many of them had been indoctrinated into an extremist ideology that justified violence as a means to avenge racial injustice. Members of this group recruited disenfranchised young men, offering them a sense of purpose and camaraderie, while also instilling a warped view of race relations. These recruits came to believe they were engaged in a racial war, and that the murders were justified as acts of revenge against white society. This belief system allowed them to commit horrific acts of violence under the pretense of retribution for racial discrimination, creating a terrifying cycle of hate-fueled violence. Faced with an increasing number of victims and growing public outcry, the San Francisco Police Department launched Operation Zebra, a large-scale manhunt aimed at catching the killers. Despite the massive effort, the investigation faced difficulties due to the killers' ability to operate under the radar, striking randomly and without warning. A break in the case finally came on March 9, 1974, when David Rice, also known as Abdul Jabbar, was arrested after a failed murder attempt. Witnesses linked him to the attacks, and his confession led to the arrests of several accomplices, including Jesse Lee Cooks. The trial was one of the most sensational and unsettling in the city's history. Rice, Cooks, and other members of the group were charged with multiple counts of murder and attempted murder. In court, the full horror of the crimes was revealed, with prosecutors presenting graphic evidence of the violence inflicted on the victims. The defendants claimed that they had been radicalized and were seeking vengeance for racial oppression. However, their actions sparked outrage and were widely condemned by the public. The trial served as a sobering reminder of how extremist ideologies could incite unimaginable violence. David Rice and his accomplices were convicted and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole.